Late in the Cretaceous, long before humans existed, the Earth supported vast ecosystems where the largest land animals relied on a simple daily requirement: steady sunlight reaching green leaves, season after season, year after year. In the rocks that mark the boundary between that world and the one that followed, a thin layer appears again and again across continents and ocean basins, carrying the same signature wherever it is found. For decades, researchers have studied that boundary through careful fieldwork, lab analysis, and repeated measurements, building a picture that does not depend on a single fossil bed or one dramatic discovery. The evidence points to an event that was both brief and global. Yet the most important consequences were not confined to the moment it occurred, and they did not spread in familiar gradual ways. In everyday experience, change usually arrives locally, softening as it moves outward through time and distance. Here the clues suggest something different, a disruption capable of affecting atmosphere, climate, and food webs almost at once, compressing what had been a stable world into a narrow interval of severe constraint. This understanding emerged slowly, as geology, chemistry, and physics began to align, each adding a piece to the same sequence rather than replacing what came before. For a very long time, the dinosaur world worked exactly as it should have, until it didn't. Welcome to the Sleepy Scientist. If you enjoy drifting through slow questions like this, you're very welcome to subscribe and settle into these calmer explorations. And if you feel like it, share where in the world you are listening from tonight, because it is always grounding to know how far these quiet ideas travel. Long before the idea of humans could even be imagined, the Earth was already very busy being itself. Continents drifted slowly across the surface, oceans opened and closed, and climates settled into patterns that would last not for generations, but for spans of time so long they're difficult to hold in mind. This was not an unfinished world, and it was not waiting for anything. It was complete, stable, and richly occupied. This stretch of Earth's history is known as the Mesozoic era, a name that simply means middle life. Not because life was halfway done, but because geologists working backward through layers of rock placed it between two other great chapters in the planet's story. The Mesozoic began after the most severe mass extinction the Earth has ever experienced, and ended with another that reshaped life just as dramatically. In between, it lasted for around 180 million years. That is long enough for entire mountain ranges to rise, wear down, and vanish again. Within that vast span, scientists divide time into three broad periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. These are not arbitrary labels, and they're not defined by round numbers on a clock. A geologic period is recognized by changes written into stone itself. When rock layers around the world begin to show the same kinds of fossils appearing or disappearing, the same shifts in chemistry, or the same signs of environmental change, geologists take that as a signal that the Earth has entered a new phase. The Triassic marks a world recovering. Life was rebuilding after catastrophe, ecosystems were simpler, and many familiar groups had yet to appear. The Jurassic follows, a time when dinosaurs became large, diverse, and firmly established across the land. By the time the Cretaceous arrives, the planet is warm, sea levels are high, flowering plants are spreading, and dinosaurs are woven into nearly every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. These divisions help scientists talk about deep time in manageable pieces, but they are still enormous by any everyday standard. Knowing the order of these events relies on methods that are quiet and methodical rather than dramatic. One of the most important is stratigraphy, the study of rock layers. In many places, sediment builds up gradually, with newer layers settling on top of older ones. By tracing these layers across regions and continents, geologists can see which rocks formed earlier and which came later. Fossils embedded within those layers act as markers, especially when certain species appear briefly and then vanish from the record. These are known as index fossils, and they help align timelines across vast distances. To go further than relative order, scientists use radiometric dating. Some minerals contain elements that decay at a steady and predictable rate. By measuring the ratio between the original element and its decay products, researchers can calculate how much time has passed since the mineral formed. This works because radioactive decay follows consistent physical laws, and those laws have not changed over the history of the planet. The result is not a guess, but a measurement, one that allows deep time to be expressed in numbers rather than impressions. Together, these tools allow the Mesozoic era to be placed not just in sequence, but in context. They turn the past from a vague backdrop into a structured timeline, one that can be examined carefully and revised as new evidence appears. The idea of deep time can feel abstract at first. Human experience is measured in years and decades, sometimes in centuries if history stretches far enough. Deep time operates on a different scale entirely. Millions of years pass with no sense of urgency. Change still happens, but it happens slowly enough that entire ecosystems can adapt, stabilize, and persist without obvious pressure. To understand the dinosaur world, it helps to imagine drifting across this timescale as an observer, watching continents shift by a few centimeters a year, watching climates settle and hold, watching life respond patiently to its surroundings. Dinosaurs emerge into this world not as sudden rulers, but as one group among many. The word dinosauria was coined in the 19th century by the British scientist Richard Owen, who recognized that certain fossil animals shared a distinctive set of features that set them apart from other reptiles. At the time, this was a bold step. Fossils were still being discovered, and the relationships between ancient animals were far from clear. Naming the group gave scientists a framework, a way to organize and compare finds that might otherwise have remained disconnected curiosities. Since then, that framework has changed and refined itself many times. New fossils have filled in gaps, and modern techniques have reshaped how relationships are understood. Phylogenetics, the study of evolutionary relationships, uses shared traits to build family trees that are revised as new data arrives. Dinosaurs, once imagined as a single uniform group, are now understood as diverse, branching lineages with deep connections to modern birds. The name remains, but the meaning has grown more precise. While dinosaurs were diversifying, the planet they lived on was markedly different from the one known today. Global temperatures were generally warmer, with little to no permanent ice at the poles. Sea levels were higher, flooding continental interiors and creating shallow seas that reshaped coastlines. Land masses were arranged differently, sometimes clustered into supercontinents, sometimes drifting apart to form new oceans. These changes altered weather patterns, migration routes, and the distribution of habitats over millions of years. Plant life formed the quiet foundation of this world. Forests of conifers, cycads, and ferns covered large areas, and later in the Cretaceous, flowering plants began to spread, changing the structure of ecosystems from the ground up. Herbivorous dinosaurs depended on this greenery, and in turn shaped it through grazing, browsing, and movement. Predators followed the herbivores, and decomposers worked constantly, recycling nutrients back into the soil. The system was complex, but it was also stable. Even the sky, though familiar in its rhythm of day and night, would not have looked exactly the same. Over deep time, the positions of stars shift relative to the Earth, a slow process that changes the shapes of constellations. The stars themselves were there. The moon still traced its path across the night, but the patterns drawn between them would have been subtly different. It was recognizably a sky, but not quite the one known now. All of this matters because it frames the idea of an ending. When thinking about the last day of the dinosaurs, it is tempting to imagine a single moment of drama, a sharp line between before and after. In reality, what scientists study is a boundary, a thin layer in the rock record that marks a transition between two worlds. That boundary captures the end of long stability and the beginning of something new, but it does not suggest that the world before it was fragile or unfinished. For most of the Mesozoic era, the dinosaur world worked. Energy flowed from sunlight into plants, from plants into animals, and back into the soil. Populations rose and fell, species appeared and vanished, but the overall structure held. It was a complete chapter of Earth's history, coherent and self-sustaining, shaped by physical laws that operated quietly and reliably. Understanding that completeness is essential. It reminds us that what follows was not the collapse of a flawed system, but the interruption of one that had been functioning for an almost unimaginable length of time. The clues to that interruption are subtle, preserved in stone, chemistry, and fossil remains, waiting to be assembled into a sequence that only becomes clear when viewed across deep time. The world that allowed dinosaurs to rise was not calm at the start. It was recovering. Long before the first dinosaur walked across dry land, the Earth had passed through the most severe biological crisis it has ever known. Near the end of the Permian period, life on land and in the oceans collapsed on a staggering scale. Vast numbers of species disappeared, ecosystems unraveled, and for a time the planet was quieter, simpler, and far less crowded than it had been before. Scientists studying this interval describe it as a bottleneck for life, a narrowing so extreme that recovery would take tens of millions of years. The causes of that earlier extinction were complex and unfolded over time. Massive volcanic eruptions released enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere, altering climate and ocean chemistry. Temperatures rose, oxygen levels fell in some environments, and the stability that complex ecosystems depend on was lost. What matters here is not the detail of that catastrophe, but its aftermath. When the Permian ended, the world that followed was not empty, but it was open. The Triassic period began on a planet still bearing the marks of disruption. Continents were locked together into a single vast landmass known as Pangaea, stretching nearly from pole to pole. This arrangement created extreme climates. Inland regions, far from the moderating influence of oceans, experienced intense heat and dryness. Seasonal swings were strong, and environments could be harsh. Life that persisted through these conditions tended to be resilient, flexible, and efficient with resources. In this recovering world, ecosystems were simpler than those of the later Mesozoic. Forests were patchier, animal communities were less crowded, and many familiar roles had not yet been filled again. This mattered. When ecosystems lose complexity, they also lose competition. Ecological space opens up, not as empty land, but as unused ways of making a living. It was into this world that the ancestors of dinosaurs appeared. Dinosaurs did not emerge in isolation. They belonged to a broader group of animals known as archosaurs. This group includes modern crocodilians and birds, as well as many extinct lineages that once shared the land. Archosaurs are defined by a suite of anatomical traits, particularly in the skull and limbs, that distinguish them from other reptiles. Among these traits was a tendency toward a more upright posture, with limbs held beneath the body rather than splayed to the sides. Early in the Triassic, archosaurs diversified into many forms. Some were predators, others herbivores, some semi-aquatic, others fully terrestrial. Dinosaurs were one branch among these experiments. What set them apart was not size or dominance at first, but efficiency. Their limb structure allowed more energy-efficient movement. Their hips and legs supported a style of locomotion that worked well over long distances and variable terrain. These advantages were subtle, but over long spans of time, subtle advantages matter. At this stage, dinosaurs were small to medium-sized animals. They did not yet tower over their environments. They shared the landscape with other archosaurs, including large crocodile-like predators that were often more immediately imposing. The rise of dinosaurs was not a takeover. It was a slow sorting process. Evolution operates without foresight. Traits that improve survival and reproduction in one generation tend to become more common in the next. This process, known as natural selection, does not aim toward dominance or complexity. It simply reflects which variations persist under particular conditions. Over millions of years, even small differences in efficiency, growth, or reproduction can accumulate into large patterns. In the Triassic world, natural selection favored animals that could cope with heat, dryness, and instability. Dinosaurs, with their upright stance and flexible body plans, fit these conditions well. They were not alone in this, but they were consistently competitive. As environments slowly stabilized, their advantages remained. An important idea in understanding this phase is ecological opportunity. When an extinction removes many species, it leaves behind roles that are no longer filled. These roles, known as niches, include ways of feeding, moving, reproducing, and interacting with the environment. When niches are empty or lightly occupied, surviving groups can expand into them. This process is sometimes described as competitive release. With fewer rivals, constraints loosen. For dinosaurs, the Triassic offered many such opportunities. As ecosystems rebuilt, dinosaurs diversified into herbivores and carnivores, into fast runners and heavy browsers. They spread across Pangaea, following rivers, coastlines, and open plains. Their radiation was not explosive, but it was persistent. Over time, dinosaurs became more common, more varied, and more deeply embedded in terrestrial ecosystems. It is important to emphasize that this rise was uneven. In some regions, dinosaurs remained minor players for long periods. In others, they became more prominent earlier. Local conditions mattered. Climate, geography, and chance all influenced which lineages flourished where. There was no single moment when dinosaurs suddenly replaced all competitors. Instead, there was a gradual shift in balance. As the Triassic moved toward its end, another turning point arrived. Environmental stress returned, and many of the large archosaurs that had competed with dinosaurs declined or vanished. The exact causes are still studied, but volcanic activity and climate shifts again played a role. When this second wave of extinction passed, dinosaurs emerged as the most widespread and diverse large land animals remaining. From that point onward, their expansion accelerated. The Jurassic period that followed saw dinosaurs increase in size, variety, and ecological influence, but even then, their dominance was built on foundations laid during recovery, not catastrophe. They did not conquer a thriving world. They grew into one that was rebuilding. This context changes how dominance is understood. Dinosaurs did not rise because they were destined to rule. They rose because the conditions of the early Mesozoic favored certain traits, and because earlier disruptions had reshaped the competitive landscape. Their success was historical as much as biological. There is a quiet lesson here. Ecosystems are not static. They carry memory in the form of past events, and those events shape what is possible long afterward. The dinosaur world was not born fully formed. It emerged slowly from a planet learning how to support complexity again. By the time dinosaurs became familiar giants, their rise was already ancient history. What looked like a stable order was the outcome of long recovery, chance survival, and patient expansion across a world that had once been nearly emptied of life. Dinosaurs did not dominate the land because of a single extraordinary trait. They worked because many ordinary biological features came together in a way that proved remarkably effective over long stretches of time. One of the most important of these features was posture. Most earlier reptiles moved with a sprawling gait, their limbs extended outward from the body, pushing against the ground from the side. This style of movement works, but it is mechanically inefficient for sustained activity. Dinosaurs, by contrast, evolved an upright stance. Their legs were positioned directly beneath their bodies, like pillars supporting a structure. This alignment allowed their weight to be carried more efficiently through bone rather than through constant muscular effort. An upright posture changes how an animal moves through the world. It reduces the energy cost of walking and running, allowing longer periods of activity without exhaustion. It also improves stability, which becomes increasingly important as body size grows. Large animals with sprawling limbs face mechanical limits. Large animals with column-like legs can grow much bigger without collapsing under their own weight. This simple structural difference opened the door to the enormous sizes later dinosaurs would reach. Locomotion efficiency also influences speed and endurance. Dinosaurs were not necessarily faster than every other animal around them, but they were well suited for steady movement across large distances, in environments shaped by seasonal change, shifting water sources and patchy vegetation. The ability to travel efficiently mattered. It allowed herbivores to follow plant growth and predators to range widely in search of prey. Over millions of years, small advantages in movement compound into large ecological effects. Breathing was another quiet advantage. In modern birds, which are living dinosaurs, the respiratory system includes a network of air sacs that move air through the lungs in a continuous flow. This differs from the back-and-forth pattern seen in mammals. The result is a highly efficient exchange of oxygen. Fossil evidence suggests that many non-avian dinosaurs, particularly theropods and sauropods, may have had similar air sac systems extending into their bodies and even into their bones. These air-filled spaces would have lightened the skeleton while improving oxygen delivery. For large animals, this combination is especially useful. Carrying less weight for the same body volume reduces the energy required to move. Efficient oxygen uptake supports sustained activity and growth. Scientists remain cautious about exactly how these systems functioned in every dinosaur group, but the anatomical clues are strong enough to suggest that advanced respiration was common. Growth patterns offer another piece of the puzzle. Studies of dinosaur bone tissue show growth rings similar to those seen in trees. These rings record periods of faster and slower growth, often linked to seasons. In many dinosaurs, the spacing of these rings suggests relatively rapid growth compared to most modern reptiles. They reached adult size faster, reducing the time spent vulnerable as juveniles. This does not mean dinosaurs were simply warm-blooded in the modern sense. The old division between cold-blooded and warm-blooded animals is too simple to capture the range of metabolic strategies seen in nature. Many researchers now think that dinosaurs occupied an intermediate zone. Their metabolism may have been higher than that of most reptiles, but not identical to that of birds or mammals. This middle ground would have allowed flexibility, supporting growth and activity without the constant high-energy demands of full warm-bloodedness. The idea that dinosaurs were active, dynamic animals gained public attention in the 20th century, in part through the work of Robert Bakker. He challenged the long-standing image of dinosaurs as slow and sluggish, arguing instead that they were energetic and responsive to their environments. While some of his claims were bold and occasionally overstated, they pushed research in productive directions. Modern paleontology has refined these ideas, replacing simple contrasts with more nuanced views grounded in fossil evidence. Feeding strategies also played a role in dinosaur success. Herbivorous dinosaurs evolved a wide range of approaches to processing plant material. Some relied on massive guts where food could ferment slowly, extracting nutrients from tough leaves. Others developed complex tooth batteries that sliced and ground vegetation efficiently. Carnivorous dinosaurs, in turn, showed diversity in hunting styles, jaw mechanics, and body shapes, allowing different species to focus on different prey sizes and behaviors. Reproduction mattered as well. Dinosaurs laid eggs, often in clutches, and many species appear to have invested in some form of nesting behavior. This strategy allowed relatively large numbers of offspring to be produced without the long gestation periods required by live birth. Even if only a fraction survived to adulthood, populations could recover and expand steadily over time. All of these features interacted with one another. Efficient movement supported wide-ranging foraging. Advanced respiration supported growth and activity. Flexible metabolism allowed adaptation to different climates. Diverse feeding strategies reduced direct competition. No single trait explains dinosaur success on its own. It was the combination that mattered. This complexity is important to hold on to. Systems built from many interacting parts can be robust, but they can also be sensitive to disruption. When conditions remain within familiar bounds, such systems perform exceptionally well. When those bounds are exceeded, the same interconnectedness can amplify stress. The traits that allowed dinosaurs to thrive across continents and climates also tied them closely to the stability of the environments they inhabited. For most of their history, that stability held. Dinosaurs worked not because they were mysterious or exceptional in a mythical sense, but because their bodies, behaviors, and environments aligned in ways that allowed life to flow smoothly through ecosystems for millions of years. Dinosaurs did not live in isolation. They were held up by networks. Every ecosystem, whether ancient or modern, is built on connections. Energy enters, moves through living bodies, and returns to the environment in altered form. When those connections are strong and well balanced, life can be abundant and stable for very long periods of time. When they fail, collapse does not need drama. It unfolds quietly, step by step. A useful way to picture this is through the idea of a food web. Unlike a simple food chain, which suggests a straight line from one organism to the next, a food web shows many overlapping paths. Plants, animals, and microorganisms are linked in multiple ways, sharing energy and matter across an entire landscape. At different positions within this web are trophic levels, a term that simply refers to where an organism sits in the flow of energy. At the base of every terrestrial food web are plants. They take in sunlight and use it to build sugars and tissues through photosynthesis. This process turns light into stored chemical energy, making plants the primary producers of the system. Everything else depends on that initial step. Herbivores feed on plants, carnivores feed on other animals, and decomposers break down waste and remains, returning nutrients to the soil so the cycle can continue. In the dinosaur world, this flow of energy supported an extraordinary range of life. Herbivorous dinosaurs occupied many different roles within the ecosystem. Some browsed low to the ground, feeding on ferns and smaller plants. Others reached higher, stripping leaves from shrubs and trees. The largest sauropods may have fed at heights no land animal can reach today, accessing foliage that would otherwise go unused. These differences mattered. By feeding at different levels and on different plant types, herbivores reduced direct competition with one another. This allowed many large species to coexist in the same regions. It also shaped the vegetation itself. Heavy browsing could open up forests while grazing maintained open spaces. In this way, herbivores did not just consume plants. They influenced how plant communities grew and changed. Digesting plant material is not easy. Leaves and stems are tough, fibrous, and often low in readily available energy. Many herbivorous dinosaurs solved this problem with size and time. Large bodies allowed for large digestive systems, where food could be held and processed slowly. Microorganisms in the gut broke down cellulose through fermentation, releasing energy over long periods. This strategy favors patience over speed. A dinosaur did not need to eat constantly if its digestive system worked steadily. Some herbivores may also have lived in groups. Fossil trackways and bone beds suggest that herd behavior was common in certain species, though the details remain debated. Moving in groups could offer protection from predators and help individuals locate food and water. It also meant that herbivores influenced the land collectively, trampling paths, dispersing seeds, and concentrating nutrients in certain areas. Above the herbivores were the predators, but their role was not simply to consume. Predators exert selective pressure on prey populations. By targeting the young, the sick, or the injured, they can help keep populations healthy and prevent overuse of resources. Predation also influences behavior. Prey animals that must remain alert and mobile are less likely to overgraze a single area for too long. Carnivorous dinosaurs varied widely in size, hunting style, and diet. Some were likely active hunters, others opportunistic scavengers, and many probably switched between the two depending on circumstances. This flexibility is common in modern ecosystems and helps stabilize food webs. A predator that can survive lean periods by scavenging is less likely to disappear when prey numbers fluctuate. Decomposers work constantly in the background. Fungi, bacteria, and small invertebrates broke down waste and dead organisms, returning nutrients to the soil and water. Without this recycling, ecosystems would quickly grind to a halt. Nutrients would become locked away in unusable forms, and primary productivity would decline. Though they rarely fossilize, decomposers are among the most important players in any ecosystem. Large dinosaurs also acted as ecosystem engineers. Simply by moving, feeding, and growing, they reshaped their environments. A massive animal pushing through vegetation creates clearings. Trails become routes for water and smaller animals. Dung spreads nutrients and seeds. Over time, these effects alter plant distribution, soil structure, and even local climate conditions. This means that dinosaurs were not just passengers in their ecosystems. They were part of the structure holding those systems together. Their presence influenced which plants thrived, which animals survived, and how energy moved across the land. All of this complexity depended on one critical factor: primary productivity. As long as plants could grow and photosynthesize at normal rates, energy flowed upward through the web. Herbivores could feed, predators could hunt, and decomposers could recycle. The system was resilient to many disturbances. Local droughts, storms, or volcanic events could cause disruption, but the overall structure endured. The vulnerability lay in the base. If plant growth slowed significantly or stopped altogether, everything above it would be affected. Herbivores would face shortages first. Predators would follow as prey declined. Decomposers would eventually run out of material to process. In such a scenario, animals are not immediately wiped out. They persist for a time, drawing on stored energy, shifting diets where possible, and reproducing less frequently. But they are living on borrowed time. Understanding dinosaur extinction as a failure of networks rather than a single violent moment helps explain why it unfolded the way it did. The dinosaur world was supported by intricate, well-balanced food webs that functioned smoothly for millions of years. That strength was also a dependence. When the flow of energy at the base was interrupted, the entire structure was placed under strain. For most of the Mesozoic, those food webs held everything up. They were not fragile, they were efficient, interconnected, and remarkably persistent. Their eventual collapse would come not from a lack of complexity, but from the sudden loss of the conditions that allowed that complexity to function at all. The world dinosaurs inhabited was shaped as much by air and water as by bone and leaf. By the late Cretaceous, Earth had settled into a climate regime very different from the one familiar today. Average global temperatures were higher, temperature differences between the equator and the poles were smaller, and permanent ice was either greatly reduced or absent altogether. This was a greenhouse world, not because it was chaotic or extreme, but because it was consistently warm over long spans of time. Without large ice sheets locking water away at the poles, sea levels were higher than they are now. Shorelines crept inland, flooding low-lying regions and reshaping continents from their edges inward. What might look like solid land on a modern map would, in the Cretaceous, have been a mosaic of coastlines, shallow seas, islands, and broad river plains. This warmth did not mean uniformity. Climate still varied with latitude, altitude, and distance from the ocean. Seasons still existed. Storms still passed through. But the overall pattern was one of relative stability. For millions of years, average conditions changed slowly enough that ecosystems could adapt and settle into long-lasting arrangements. Scientists know this not because they can measure ancient temperatures directly, but because the planet left clues behind. One of the most useful tools for reconstructing ancient climates is the study of oxygen isotopes. Oxygen atoms come in slightly different forms, known as isotopes, which behave differently during processes like evaporation and condensation. When water evaporates from the ocean and later falls as rain or snow, the ratios of these isotopes shift in predictable ways depending on temperature. Marine organisms that build shells or skeletons from seawater record these ratios in their hard parts. When those shells fossilize, they preserve a chemical snapshot of the conditions in which they formed. By measuring oxygen isotope ratios in fossils and sedimentary rocks, researchers can infer past ocean temperatures and even estimate how much ice was present at the poles. Consistently, late Cretaceous samples point to warm oceans and reduced polar ice, reinforcing the picture of a greenhouse Earth. Sediment cores provide another line of evidence. Layers of sediment accumulate on the ocean floor and in lakes year after year, capturing changes in climate, sea level, and biological activity. Fine-grained sediments, chemical markers, and fossil remains within these cores tell a story of shifting environments. In many Cretaceous cores, signs of widespread shallow seas and warm conditions appear again and again. Fossil plants add further detail. Leaves are sensitive to climate, and their shapes, sizes, and vein patterns reflect the temperatures and rainfall regimes in which they grew. By comparing fossil leaves to modern plants, scientists can estimate ancient climate conditions on land. These indicators support the same conclusion as the chemical data. Much of the dinosaur world was warm, humid in some regions, dry in others, but rarely cold. Together, these different proxies create a coherent picture. None of them is perfect on its own, but when they align, confidence grows. This is how paleoclimate reconstruction works. It relies on multiple, independent clues pointing in the same direction. High sea levels were one of the most visible consequences of this climate. Vast epicontinental seas spread across continents, creating shallow marine environments far from today's coastlines. In North America, for example, a broad inland sea once divided the continent, linking the Arctic to the Gulf region. Similar shallow seas existed elsewhere, turning interior basins into marine habitats and fragmenting land masses into networks of islands and peninsulas. These inland seas changed more than geography. Water moderates temperature, so coastal and near-coastal regions tend to experience milder climates. As seas spread inland, they softened seasonal extremes, altered rainfall patterns, and influenced vegetation across wide areas. Marine life flourished in these shallow waters, while terrestrial ecosystems adapted to new coastlines and shifting land connections. Biodiversity often increases in such settings. Shallow seas support rich marine communities, and fragmented landscapes can promote diversification on land by isolating populations. Over long periods, this process contributes to the variety seen in both dinosaur lineages and the plants and animals around them. What stands out about this world is not just its warmth, but its persistence. Climate conditions remained within familiar bounds for millions of years. This kind of stability encourages specialization. When environments are predictable, organisms can afford to become finely tuned to particular conditions. Plants can optimize leaf structures for consistent light and moisture. Herbivores can evolve feeding strategies matched to specific vegetation. Predators can refine hunting behaviors suited to reliable prey. Specialization is efficient. It allows ecosystems to extract more energy from their surroundings and support larger, more complex communities. It is one reason the dinosaur world became so productive and so diverse. But specialization carries an implicit assumption that the background conditions will continue. Climate variability still existed, but it unfolded slowly. Gradual shifts in sea level, temperature, or rainfall allowed time for populations to adjust. There was no frequent need for rapid adaptation to extreme change. Over time, many lineages became deeply embedded in the specific climates and geographies they inhabited. Understanding this balance between stability and variability is crucial. A stable climate does not mean a fragile one. On the contrary, it often supports resilience. But it does mean that ecosystems are organized around a particular set of expectations. When those expectations are violated abruptly, the response can be severe. Modern scientists study these ancient climates using tools that did not exist when the first dinosaur fossils were described. Climate models, originally developed to understand present and future climate change, are now used to test scenarios from deep time. By adjusting variables like atmospheric composition, continental arrangement, and solar input, researchers can simulate ancient climates and see whether the results match geological evidence. Organizations such as NASA contribute to this work by developing and refining models that simulate Earth's climate system. These models are modern, but the questions they are used to explore are ancient. When simulations of the Cretaceous reproduce warm poles, high sea levels, and reduced temperature gradients, confidence in the underlying picture grows. The late Mesozoic climate was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in shaping life on Earth. It influenced where plants could grow, how animals moved, and how ecosystems were connected across the globe. It provided the steady conditions under which dinosaurs thrived and food webs became deeply interwoven. At the same time, it quietly set the stage for vulnerability. A world accustomed to warmth, high seas, and steady energy flow is not inherently weak, but it is tuned to those conditions. When change comes slowly, tuning can be adjusted. When change comes suddenly, tuning becomes a constraint. For most of the dinosaur era, the atmosphere and oceans behaved predictably. Winds followed familiar patterns. Currents distributed heat reliably. Seasons repeated with only minor variation. Life adapted not just to survive in this world, but to make the most of it. Seen this way, the late Cretaceous was not a world on the brink. It was a world at equilibrium, finely balanced and deeply productive. Its warmth and high seas were signs of long-term stability, not impending collapse. That stability is what makes the later disruptions so instructive. When the atmosphere and oceans are suddenly disturbed, the effects do not stay local. They ripple outward, altering climate, chemistry, and circulation on a planetary scale. To understand what happened at the end of the dinosaur world, it is essential to first understand the calm conditions that came before. This was a planet that had learned how to run smoothly. Air and water moved energy gently and reliably from place to place. Life organized itself around that reliability. For millions of years, it worked. If climate set the stage for the dinosaur world, plants wrote the script. Every land ecosystem, no matter how large or complex, begins with organisms that can do something remarkable. They take light from the sun and turn it into food. Everything else follows from that single transformation. Muscles, bones, brains, teeth, and claws are all built on energy that first passed through leaves. Early in the Mesozoic, the green world was dominated by plant groups that would seem unfamiliar today. Ferns spread their fronds across damp ground and forest floors. Cycads, with stout trunks and crowns of stiff leaves, dotted warm landscapes. Conifers formed vast forests. Their needle-like leaves adapted to reduce water loss and tolerate seasonal dryness. These plants were successful because they were well matched to the climates of the time. They grew steadily, reproduced reliably, and formed the base of terrestrial food webs for millions of years. Herbivorous dinosaurs adapted to these plants in turn. Tough leaves and fibrous stems required patience and volume rather than speed. Large bodies, long digestive tracts, and slow fermentation allowed energy to be extracted from vegetation that would be difficult for smaller animals to use. This relationship worked well. Plants grew, herbivores fed, predators followed, and nutrients cycled back into the soil. For a long time, this green foundation changed slowly. Then, during the Cretaceous, something new began to spread. Flowering plants, known scientifically as angiosperms, appeared and diversified rapidly. Unlike earlier plant groups, angiosperms enclosed their seeds within fruits and flowers. This simple structural change opened up many possibilities. Seeds could be protected, dispersed by animals, or packaged with nutrients that improve survival. Flowers allowed plants to interact with insects and other pollinators in new ways, increasing the efficiency and precision of reproduction. Angiosperms also tended to grow faster than many older plant groups. They could colonize disturbed ground quickly, respond rapidly to changing conditions, and adopt a wide range of forms, from low-growing herbs to towering trees. This flexibility gave them an advantage in many environments, especially in a world shaped by shifting coastlines and variable climates. As flowering plants spread, landscapes began to change, forest structure altered, understories grew denser, seasonal patterns of leaf growth and shedding became more pronounced in some regions. New food sources appeared not just for herbivores, but for insects, which in turn became food for other animals. The web of life gained new threads. This expansion did not replace older plants overnight. Ferns, cycads, and conifers continued to thrive in many habitats, and they remain important parts of modern ecosystems today. But angiosperms added complexity and productivity. They increased the rate at which energy entered food webs, supporting larger and more diverse animal communities. With this increase came interaction. As plants evolved new defenses, thicker leaves, tougher tissues, chemical deterrents, herbivores responded. Teeth shapes diversified, jaw mechanics shifted, feeding strategies became more specialized. This back and forth is known as coevolution. It describes a process where changes in one group drive changes in another, not through intention, but through long-term selection. If a plant evolves a compound that makes its leaves harder to digest, herbivores that can tolerate or avoid that compound gain an advantage. If herbivores become more efficient at feeding, plants that deter them gain an advantage in turn. Over time, this leads to escalation. Not a battle in any conscious sense, but a pattern of mutual influence that shapes both sides. Dinosaurs were active participants in this process. Large herbivores influenced which plants spread by feeding selectively and by physically reshaping vegetation. Smaller herbivores exploited niches opened by new plant types. Even predators were indirectly involved, as changes in herbivore behavior and distribution altered hunting opportunities. Through all of this, one process remained central: photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the method by which plants use light energy to combine carbon dioxide and water into sugars, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Those sugars are not just fuel for the plant itself, they are the starting point for nearly all food on land. When an herbivore eats a leaf, it is consuming stored sunlight. When a predator eats an herbivore, it is consuming sunlight that has already passed through one living body. This makes photosynthesis the planet's primary energy gateway. It is where outside energy enters the biological system. Everything else is recycling. As long as sunlight reaches leaves in sufficient quantity, ecosystems can function. They may change in composition, but energy continues to flow. When sunlight is reduced, that flow slows. When it stops, no amount of adaptation can fully compensate. This is why plants matter so much in understanding extinction. A world can have abundant animals, intricate food webs, and stable climates, but all of it rests on green surfaces quietly doing chemistry. Leaves do not store vast reserves. They operate in real time, capturing energy day by day. If light levels drop significantly, photosynthesis declines almost immediately. This vulnerability is easy to overlook because it is so basic. Sunlight arrives every morning, plants respond, life continues. The reliability of this process is what allows complexity to build on top of it. Over millions of years, that reliability becomes an assumption built into every ecosystem. By the late Cretaceous, the dinosaur world had become richly productive. Flowering plants had expanded the capacity of ecosystems to generate food. Herbivores were abundant and diverse. Predators tracked those populations. Nutrient cycles were well established. On land, energy flowed smoothly from sun to leaf to animal. This productivity made the world feel secure, but it also meant that more life depended on uninterrupted photosynthesis than ever before. More animals, larger bodies, and more specialized diets all increased reliance on a steady input of light. When productivity is high, margins can become thin. Systems run efficiently, but efficiency often leaves little room for prolonged interruption. The quiet power of plants is that they do not announce their importance. They do not move quickly. They do not hunt or flee. They simply turn light into matter, over and over again, supporting everything above them. Understanding this reframes the dinosaur story. The end of the dinosaurs is not primarily a story about animals failing. It is a story about the green foundation beneath them being disrupted. A sudden loss of sunlight does not just affect plants. It reaches upward through the entire web. Herbivores face shortages within weeks to months. Predators follow as prey declines. Reproduction slows. Populations shrink. Extinction becomes a process rather than an instant. This is why darkness, even temporary darkness, is so dangerous to a living world built on leaves. The Cretaceous landscape was lush and active, filled with motion and sound. But its true engine was silent. Leaves unfolded, captured light, and built the energy that allowed everything else to exist. When that engine runs, life flourishes. When it stalls, even briefly, the consequences travel far beyond the forest floor. A planet can support towering animals and complex ecosystems, but in the end, it is powered by something much simpler. Thin green surfaces turn toward the sun, doing the quiet work that makes all other life possible. For most of the late Cretaceous, the dinosaur world appeared calm, productive, and well-established. But calm does not always mean unstressed. Earth systems have a way of carrying strain quietly. Pressures can build without obvious surface drama, spreading unevenly across regions and environments. By the time something finally gives way, the underlying conditions may have been shifting for a long time. In the final few million years of the Cretaceous, the planet was still warm and rich with life, but it was not perfectly static. Sea levels, though generally high, were not fixed. They rose and fell in response to slow changes in ocean temperature, tectonic movement, and the shape of ocean basins. Even modest sea level fluctuations could redraw coastlines over vast areas, especially in regions dominated by shallow seas. When shorelines move, habitats move with them. Forests retreat or advance. Wetlands appear and disappear. River systems reorganize. For animals tied closely to particular environments, these changes matter. They fragment populations, isolate groups, and force migrations. None of this causes immediate collapse, but it introduces friction into systems that had previously flowed smoothly. Regional climate patterns also shifted subtly during this time. While global temperatures remained relatively warm, some areas experienced changes in rainfall, seasonality, or temperature extremes. These were not sudden ice ages or heat spikes, but gradual adjustments that played out over thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Plants responded first, adjusting growth patterns and distributions. Herbivores followed. Predators adjusted in turn. Such changes are part of Earth's normal behavior. Ecosystems are not fragile simply because they change, but repeated or overlapping stresses can reduce resilience. When populations are already coping with shifting habitats or altered food availability, their ability to absorb additional disturbance declines. One of the most significant background processes underway during the late Cretaceous was a prolonged episode of volcanism in what is now India. This event produced what are known as the Deccan Traps, a vast region covered by layers of hardened lava. The term flood basalt refers to eruptions that release enormous volumes of lava, not as a single explosion, but as repeated outpourings over extended periods of time. These eruptions did not occur all at once. They unfolded in pulses, with lava flows spreading across the landscape again and again, eventually covering an area larger than many modern countries. The thickness of the accumulated lava in some places reaches several kilometers, a testament to the scale of the activity. Volcanism of this magnitude affects more than just the land it covers. As magma rises and erupts, it releases gases into the atmosphere. Among the most important are carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds. Carbon dioxide contributes to warming by trapping heat, while sulfur compounds can form aerosols that reflect sunlight and cool the surface. The balance between these effects depends on the timing, intensity, and chemistry of the eruptions. In the oceans, volcanic gases can alter chemistry as well. Increased carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, forming acids that can lower ocean pH. This process, known as ocean acidification, makes it harder for some marine organisms to build shells and skeletons. Sulfur compounds can also lead to acid rain, affecting soils, plants, and freshwater systems on land. None of these effects need to be catastrophic on their own. Life has endured volcanic episodes many times in Earth's history, but they do represent sustained environmental pressure. They nudge climate, chemistry, and ecosystems away from the conditions they are adapted to, and they do so over long spans of time. Importantly, these stresses would not have been felt evenly. Some regions may have been largely unaffected, while others experienced more pronounced changes. This unevenness is part of what makes the late Cretaceous picture complex. A world can be broadly stable while still containing pockets of vulnerability. Modern research increasingly frames extinction events not as the result of a single cause acting in isolation, but as the outcome of multiple stresses overlapping in time. This idea is sometimes referred to as a multi-stressor extinction model. In this view, factors like climate change, habitat loss, and volcanic activity can weaken ecosystems, making them more susceptible to additional shocks. This framing does not diminish the role of any one event. Instead, it recognizes that ecosystems are systems. Their response to disturbance depends on their current state. A healthy, unstressed system may absorb a large shock and recover. A system already under strain may tip into collapse under a smaller additional pressure. The scientific discussion around late Cretaceous stresses has benefited from increasingly precise dating techniques. By measuring the ages of volcanic rocks, ash layers, and sediment deposits with high accuracy, researchers can determine when different events occurred relative to one another. This work draws on geochronology, the science of dating geological materials. Organizations such as United States Geological Survey contribute to this broader effort by developing and applying methods for understanding volcanic histories, magma chemistry, and eruption timing. While their work spans many time periods, the same tools help clarify what was happening on Earth in the final stages of the Cretaceous. What emerges from this research is not a picture of a world in free fall, but one of a world carrying background stress. Sea levels were shifting, climates were adjusting, volcanism was altering atmospheric and oceanic chemistry. Life continued to thrive, but not without adaptation and cost. This context matters because it changes how later events are interpreted. If the dinosaur world had been perfectly unstressed, any sudden disruption would have encountered systems operating at full resilience. If, instead, some systems were already stretched thin, this same disruption could have far more severe consequences. It is also important to note what this chapter does not suggest. Dinosaurs were not declining as a group before their extinction. Many lineages were diverse and widespread. Ecosystems were productive. There is no evidence of a slow, universal fade. Stress does not always announce itself through obvious decline. Often it shows up only in hindsight, when scientists trace patterns backward from an endpoint. Slight shifts in diversity here, regional changes there, signals that are subtle on their own but meaningful when combined. This is the quiet nature of instability. It does not roar, it accumulates. By the late Cretaceous, the planet had been running smoothly for a very long time, but it was not immune to disturbance. The same interconnectedness that made ecosystems efficient also allowed stress to propagate across regions and systems. Changes in sea level affected coastlines, changes in climate affected plants, changes in chemistry affected oceans. Each influence touched others. Understanding this background of hidden instability does not rewrite the story of dinosaur extinction. It deepens it. It reminds us that Earth history is rarely shaped by single causes acting on blank slates. Instead, it unfolds through interactions, timing, and context. The dinosaur world was not broken before its end, but it was carrying the ordinary strains of a living planet, responding to slow changes while maintaining remarkable productivity. That balance would matter greatly when a new and very different kind of disturbance entered the system. Seen from this perspective, the late Cretaceous was not a countdown. It was a moment of equilibrium, layered with subtle pressures, waiting to be tested. While conditions on Earth were shaped by air, water, and living systems, the planet was never isolated. It moved through a crowded solar system, sharing space with countless other objects, each following its own path under the same physical rules. Asteroids are among the oldest remnants of that system. They formed more than 4 billion years ago, when the Sun and planets were still assembling from a rotating disk of gas and dust. Most of the material in that disk gathered into planets, but not all of it. Some fragments never became part of a larger body. They remained as leftover debris, orbiting the Sun ever since. These objects vary widely in size. Some are no larger than a grain of sand. Others span hundreds of kilometers. Most are irregular in shape, shaped by ancient collisions rather than internal geology. They are made primarily of rock and metal, reflecting the conditions close to the young Sun where they formed. Comets are different. They formed farther from the Sun, in colder regions of the early solar system. Instead of being mostly rock and metal, comets contain large amounts of ice mixed with dust. When a comet approaches the inner solar system, heat causes its ice to vaporize, creating the glowing tails that make comets so distinctive in the night sky. Asteroids, by contrast, usually remain dark and quiet, even when they pass close to the Sun. The distinction between asteroids and comets is not always perfectly sharp, but their typical behaviors differ. Asteroids tend to follow more circular orbits that keep them relatively close to the plane of the planets. Comets often travel on elongated paths that carry them far from the Sun and then swing them inward again after long intervals. All of these objects move according to the same underlying rules. Gravity governs their motion, pulling each body toward others in proportion to mass and distance. These forces are steady and predictable. Once an orbit is set, an object will continue along that path unless something disturbs it. Disturbances do happen, but they are usually small. A close pass by a planet can nudge an asteroid's trajectory slightly. Over long spans of time, these tiny changes can accumulate. An orbit that was once safely distant can slowly shift, becoming more elongated or more inclined. The process is gradual, unfolding over thousands or millions of years, but it is persistent. This is what gives the solar system its sense of slow traffic. Objects move along well-defined lanes, but those lanes are not fixed forever. They drift, overlap, and occasionally cross. Near-Earth objects are asteroids or comets whose orbits bring them close to Earth's path around the Sun. The term does not imply danger by itself. It simply describes proximity. Most near-Earth objects pass by without incident, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Their existence reflects orbital geometry rather than imminent threat. Modern astronomy keeps track of many of these objects using dedicated sky surveys. Telescopes scan the sky repeatedly, looking for points of light that shift position against the background stars. By measuring those shifts over time, astronomers can calculate orbits and project future paths. The physics involved is well understood, allowing predictions to be made with increasing precision. Organizations such as European Space Agency are involved in these efforts, supporting planetary defense programs that catalogue near-Earth objects and assess their trajectories. The aim is not to create alarm, but to understand what is out there and how it moves. Knowledge reduces uncertainty. From a human perspective, impacts feel dramatic because they are rare within recorded history. But on geological timescales, they are part of the background. The surfaces of the Moon, Mars, and many other bodies in the solar system are covered with craters, silent records of collisions that happened over billions of years. Earth bears the same history, though erosion, plate tectonics, and vegetation have erased many of the marks. An impact does not require chaos or malfunction, it requires alignment. If an object's orbit crosses Earth's path at the right time, a collision can occur. The probability is low at any given moment, but given enough time, unlikely events become possible. This perspective helps reframe the idea of an asteroid impact. It was not a cosmic accident in the sense of randomness. It was the outcome of predictable motion unfolding over very long timescales. The same gravitational rules that keep planets in stable orbits also allow debris to wander gradually into new configurations. Space in this view is not empty. It is populated by countless objects, each obeying simple laws. Most pass unnoticed. A few cross paths with planets. Fewer still collide. The rarity of such events does not make them anomalous. It makes them infrequent. For most of Earth's history, impacts large enough to affect global systems have been separated by tens of millions of years. That spacing is long enough for ecosystems to recover and diversify between events. It is also long enough for the memory of the previous event to fade from the rock record, leaving only subtle traces. By the late Cretaceous, Earth had been free from a truly massive impact for a very long time. Life had spread, specialized, and stabilized. Food webs were complex. Climate patterns were familiar. The planet was not anticipating anything unusual, because planets do not anticipate. They respond. The slow traffic of the solar system continued regardless of conditions on Earth. Asteroids followed their orbits. Gravitational interactions nudged some paths slightly inward or outward. Most of these changes had no consequence for life on Earth. A very small fraction altered the geometry just enough to matter. It is important to hold on to the scale involved. The processes that move asteroids into Earth crossing orbits operate over millions of years. There is no sudden release, no moment when the solar system becomes more violent. The background remains steady. What changes is configuration. This steadiness is part of why the eventual impact had such profound effects. It arrived not as part of a series of escalating events, but as an interruption to normality. Earth's systems were not in a state of constant bombardment. They were tuned to relative calm. Understanding this cosmic context also tempers how the event is imagined. There was no malice, no targeting, no drama in the sky until the final approach. For most of its existence, the impacting object was just another piece of debris, circling the sun as it had done for eons. When that path finally intersected Earth's, the consequences were enormous, but the motion itself was ordinary. Gravity did what gravity always does. Seen this way, the story is not about an unpredictable universe suddenly turning hostile. It is about a universe that follows consistent rules, even when the outcomes of those rules are disruptive for life on a particular planet. The dinosaur world existed within this larger framework. It was shaped by climate, plants, and ecosystems on Earth, but it was also subject to the wider environment of the solar system. Most of the time, that wider environment was irrelevant. Occasionally, it was decisive. By placing the impact within the slow, methodical motion of celestial bodies, it becomes easier to see it not as a twist in the narrative, but as part of the same continuity that governs everything else. Planets orbit, debris drifts, intersections happen. The rarity of such intersections does not make them unnatural. It makes them infrequent expressions of the same physics that keeps the night sky orderly and predictable. For millions of years, Earth moved through this traffic without incident. Life adapted to conditions on the planet's surface, largely unaware of the wider system beyond. When the paths finally crossed, the result would reshape life on Earth. But the mechanism behind it was neither sudden nor mysterious. It was slow motion, playing out over deep time until it reached the one moment where timing mattered. By the late 20th century, the evidence for a sudden change at the end of the Cretaceous was already well known. Fossils showed a sharp boundary where many species vanished. Rock layers marked a clear before and after. What remained uncertain was the cause. For a long time, explanations focused on gradual processes. Climate change, shifting sea levels, and volcanic activity all seemed plausible. These forces were familiar, and they acted over long periods. The idea that something abrupt and external might be responsible felt unnecessary to many researchers. Earth, after all, was perfectly capable of reshaping life on its own. The shift came not from a spectacular discovery, but from a careful measurement. In the late 1970s, a geologist named Walter Alvarez was studying limestone layers in Italy that spanned the boundary between the Cretaceous and the following period. These rocks recorded a slow, steady accumulation of sediment over millions of years. Within that sequence was a thin clay layer marking the boundary itself. It was visually unremarkable, but chemically intriguing. To understand how long that clay layer represented, Walter Alvarez collaborated with his father, the physicist Luis Alvarez. Their approach was indirect. Instead of trying to date the layer directly, they measured how much of a rare element it contained. That element was iridium. Iridium is extremely scarce in Earth's crust. During the planet's formation, most of it sank toward the core along with other heavy metals. At the surface, iridium is usually found only in trace amounts. Meteorites, however, often contain much higher concentrations. They preserve the composition of the early solar system, before planets separated their elements internally. When the Alvarezes measured the iridium content of the boundary clay, they found something unexpected. The concentration was far higher than normal crustal levels. More importantly, the same elevated iridium appeared at the same boundary layer in samples from other parts of the world. This was not a local anomaly, it was global. If iridium is rare on Earth but common in extraterrestrial material, and if a thin layer of iridium appears worldwide at the same moment in geological time, one explanation stands out. A large amount of extraterrestrial material must have entered Earth's system all at once. The Alvarezes proposed that a massive asteroid impact had occurred at the end of the Cretaceous, ejecting dust and debris into the atmosphere and spreading iridium around the globe before it settled onto the surface. At the time, this idea was controversial. It challenged the prevailing preference for gradual explanations. It also implied an event of extraordinary scale. Extraordinary claims, as scientists often say, require extraordinary evidence. That evidence began to accumulate. One important line came from a mineral called quartz. Under normal conditions, quartz crystals form in orderly patterns. Under extreme pressure, such as that generated by a powerful impact, the crystal structure becomes deformed in distinctive ways. These features are known as shocked quartz. They are not produced by ordinary volcanic activity or tectonic stress. Shocked quartz grains were found in boundary layers at multiple sites. Their presence indicated that rocks had been subjected to immense, sudden pressure. This was consistent with an impact scenario. Another clue came from tiny spherical particles known as spherules. These form when molten material is ejected into the atmosphere, cools rapidly, and solidifies as it falls back to Earth. Spherules can be produced by impacts and large volcanic eruptions, but their composition and distribution at the boundary pointed toward an extraterrestrial source. In some regions, sediment layers near the boundary also showed signs of large-scale water movement. These included deposits interpreted as tsunami debris, suggesting that something had displaced vast volumes of ocean water in a short time. While such deposits are complex and not uniform everywhere, they added to the growing picture of a sudden, energetic event. None of these pieces of evidence was decisive on its own. That is how science works. Individual observations can often be explained in more than one way. What matters is convergence. When multiple independent lines of evidence point toward the same conclusion, confidence increases. The impact hypothesis gained strength as more sites were studied. Iridium anomalies appeared across continents. Shocked minerals turned up far from any volcanic source. Glassy spherules matched the chemistry expected from vaporized crust mixed with extraterrestrial material. Peer review played a central role in this process. Claims were tested, criticized, refined, and sometimes rejected. Alternative explanations were proposed and evaluated. Volcanic eruptions were examined as potential sources of iridium and spherules. In some cases, they could account for small-scale features. They could not account for the global pattern. Over time, the impact hypothesis moved from speculative to plausible, and then from plausible to strongly supported. It did not replace other factors outright. Instead, it reframed the discussion. The question was no longer whether an impact happened, but how it interacted with Earth's existing systems. One implication followed naturally from the evidence. If the iridium layer was global, then the source must also have been global in reach. That meant the impact itself was not a local event. It had to be large enough to distribute material around the entire planet. A signal that broad demanded a source that powerful. This realization shifted scientific attention from chemistry to geography. If an asteroid had struck Earth, where was the crater? Large impacts leave scars. Even if erosion and tectonics erase them over time, traces usually remain. Finding the source became the next challenge. The hypothesis had changed everything about how the end of the dinosaurs was understood. It introduced a sudden, external trigger into a story previously dominated by slow, internal change. It also connected Earth's biological history directly to the wider solar system, showing that life on this planet does not evolve in isolation. Importantly, the hypothesis did not emerge fully formed or universally accepted. It earned its place through evidence, debate, and repeated testing. That process is not a flaw in science. It is the mechanism that allows bold ideas to be evaluated without spectacle. By the time researchers began seriously searching for the impact site itself, the question was no longer whether something extraordinary had happened at the boundary. The chemistry, minerals, and sediments had already answered that. The remaining task was to locate the physical mark left behind, the place where cosmic motion met Earth's surface and converted orbital energy into geological consequence. A global signal implies a global event, and a global event must have a point of origin somewhere on the planet, waiting to be found. The evidence for a global event pointed to a single conclusion. Somewhere on Earth, there had to be a scar. At first, that scar was not obvious. Unlike the Moon, Earth constantly reshapes its surface. Plate tectonics recycle crust. Erosion smooths relief. Vegetation and sediment bury what remains. If a large impact had occurred tens of millions of years ago, its trace might be subtle, hidden beneath layers of younger material. The breakthrough came not from the surface, but from beneath it. In the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula, geophysicists had long noticed something unusual. Measurements of Earth's gravity and magnetic field revealed a broad, circular pattern buried under limestone and shallow seas. These patterns did not match ordinary geological structures. They suggested something dense and disturbed lying below. This buried structure became known as the Chicxulub crater, named after a nearby town. Today it lies mostly underground and partly offshore, concealed beneath sediments that accumulated after the event. That concealment explains why it escaped notice for so long. There is no dramatic rim visible from above, no obvious bowl in the landscape. What remains is detectable only through careful measurement. Gravity anomalies are one of the key tools that reveal the crater's presence. Gravity varies slightly from place to place depending on the density of rocks beneath the surface. Impact events can melt rock, fracture it, and rearrange it in ways that create distinctive density patterns. In the case of Chicxulub, gravity data showed a ring-shaped structure consistent with a large impact basin filled with denser material. Magnetic signatures added another piece. When rock melts and cools, magnetic minerals within it can realign. This leaves behind patterns that differ from undisturbed crust. The magnetic data from the Yucatan region matched what geophysicists expect from massive impact melt, reinforcing the interpretation. Together, these measurements acted like fingerprints. They did not rely on fossils or chemistry alone. They pointed to a physical structure with the right size, shape, and age to match the global boundary signal. To move beyond inference, scientists needed direct samples. Drilling projects provided that opportunity. By extracting cores from beneath the seafloor and land surface, researchers could examine the rocks laid down at the moment of impact and immediately afterward. These efforts involved international collaboration and careful planning, including work supported by the International Ocean Discovery Program, which coordinates scientific drilling in oceans around the world. The cores revealed a chaotic sequence of materials unlike ordinary sedimentary layers. At the base were impact melt rocks, formed when immense energy instantly liquefied crustal material. Above them lay breccias, jumbled mixtures of rock fragments fused together by heat and pressure. These rocks record violent excavation and collapse, the direct mechanical consequences of impact. Within these layers, scientists found shocked minerals, including quartz grains bearing microscopic features created only under extreme pressure. These features match those found at the global boundary layer, linking the crater directly to the worldwide signal. Above the impact debris, the cores showed a gradual return to more typical sedimentation. Fine particles settled out of the water column. Life slowly reappeared in the fossil record. The sequence preserved a moment of disruption followed by recovery, all stacked vertically in rock. What makes Chicxulub especially compelling is how well its timing aligns with the boundary. Radiometric dating of the impact melt places the event at the end of the Cretaceous, within the same narrow window marked by iridium and extinction in the fossil record. Independent methods converged on the same moment in time. The scale of the crater is difficult to grasp without comparison. Chicxulub spans a region comparable in width to a large country, with effects extending far beyond the central zone. The impact excavated vast volumes of rock and launched debris high into the atmosphere. Even though erosion and burial have softened its features, the underlying structure remains immense. Importantly, the crater sits in a region rich in carbonate rocks and sulfur-bearing minerals. When these materials were vaporized by the impact, they would have released additional gases into the atmosphere. This detail helps explain how a single collision could have such far-reaching environmental consequences, amplifying effects beyond the initial blast. The discovery of Chicxulub did not end scientific discussion. It refined it. With a physical site identified, researchers could model the event more accurately, estimating how much material was ejected, how high it traveled, and how it interacted with the atmosphere and oceans. The crater provided boundary conditions for understanding what followed. It also transformed the impact hypothesis from an abstract idea into a geographic reality. This was no longer a distant asteroid inferred from chemistry alone. It was a specific place on Earth, with rocks that could be touched, drilled, measured, and dated. One of the striking aspects of Chicxulub is how quiet it appears today. The region is flat. Vegetation covers the land. The sea above part of the crater is shallow and calm. Nothing in the modern landscape announces what lies beneath. The scar is there, but it does not dominate the surface. This contrast highlights an important point. Earth does not preserve trauma in obvious ways forever. Time smooths and buries even the largest disruptions. What remains are subtle signals that require careful interpretation. The Chicxulub crater connects the global story to a single location. It anchors chemistry to geology, hypothesis to structure. It shows that the end of the dinosaur world was not just recorded in thin layers of clay, but carved into the planet itself. With the crater identified, the focus shifts from finding the cause to understanding the consequences. The rocks record the moment of impact, but the effects extended far beyond the crater's rim. Energy released at that site interacted with the atmosphere, the oceans, and the biosphere, triggering changes that unfolded over months, years, and longer. Chicxulub is not just evidence of an impact. It is the hinge between cosmic motion and earthly response, the place where predictable orbital paths intersected with the living planet. The scar under the sea tells the same story as the iridium layer and the shocked minerals. Something extraordinary happened, and it happened here. When the asteroid reached Earth, the most important thing about it was not its size or its speed on their own, but what happened when motion stopped. The object had been travelling through space for millions of years, carrying kinetic energy simply by moving. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion, and it increases with both mass and speed. When that motion ended abruptly against Earth's surface, the energy had to go somewhere. It did not vanish, it transformed. In a fraction of a second, kinetic energy was converted into heat, pressure, and mechanical disruption. Rock behaved less like solid ground and more like fluid. The surface did not absorb the impact gently. It responded violently, because the timescale was so short. No material can gradually deform when subjected to that kind of sudden force. The point of impact became a zone of extreme temperature. Rock was instantly heated to the point of melting and vaporization. This was not fire in the ordinary sense. It was a physical consequence of compression and friction occurring faster than heat could escape. The result was a rapidly expanding cloud of vaporized rock and superheated debris. From that center, shock waves propagated outward through the ground. These are not metaphorical waves, but real compressive pulses that travel through solid material. They move faster than the speed of sound in rock, fracturing and displacing layers as they go. Close to the impact, the ground would have behaved almost elastically, compressing and rebounding before collapsing into the growing crater. Seismic shaking extended far beyond the crater itself. The energy released was equivalent to many of the largest earthquakes combined, delivered all at once. Regions hundreds and even thousands of kilometers away would have experienced intense ground motion. Slopes failed, faults slipped, landslides were triggered wherever terrain was already unstable. Above the ground, the atmosphere responded just as abruptly. The expanding vapor plume drove a powerful air blast outward from the impact site. This blast was a pressure wave moving through the atmosphere, compressing air ahead of it and dragging material along behind. Close to the crater, the air blast would have flattened forests and stripped vegetation. Farther away it weakened, but it still carried enough force to damage ecosystems over large areas. Where the impact occurred near shallow seas, the effects extended into the water. The sudden displacement of ocean water generated waves unlike ordinary storms. These were tsunamis, long wavelength waves created not by wind, but by the movement of the seafloor itself. Once formed, they travelled across ocean basins carrying energy far from their point of origin. Tsunamis behave differently from surface waves. In deep water they may pass almost unnoticed, with only subtle changes in sea level. As they approach shallow coastlines, however, they slow down and grow taller. The water piles up, and when it reaches land, it can flood far inland before retreating. Geological deposits consistent with such waves appear in regions far from the impact site, supporting this reconstruction. Meanwhile, material excavated by the impact was being launched upward. Ejecta consists of rock fragments and molten droplets thrown out of the crater at high speed. Some of this material fell back nearby, contributing to the chaotic debris layers found close to the crater. Some was launched so fast that it travelled on ballistic paths around the planet before re-entering the atmosphere. As this ejecta re-entered, it encountered the air at high speed. Friction with the atmosphere heated the falling material, causing it to glow. At the same time, heat was transferred from the debris into the surrounding air. This process did not require flames spreading from place to place. It created a global pulse of elevated temperatures near the surface. Under these conditions, dry vegetation could ignite, not necessarily everywhere at once, and not necessarily as a single continuous fire, but in many regions nearly simultaneously. The result was widespread burning, adding smoke and soot to the atmosphere. This is inferred not from imagination, but from layers of charcoal and soot found in boundary sediments around the world. It is important to note that these effects did not occur in isolation or sequence as neat stages. Many were happening at once, overlapping in time. Ground shaking, air blast, ejecta fallout, and tsunamis were all consequences of the same rapid energy release. The timescale matters. Most of this unfolded within hours. The excavation of the crater itself likely took only minutes. Shockwaves raced outward faster than any living thing could respond. The air blast followed shortly after. Ejecta began falling back within tens of minutes to hours, depending on how far it travelled. These reconstructions are not guesswork. They are built from physics, from the properties of materials under extreme conditions, and from comparisons with smaller impacts observed or recreated in experiments. Computer models simulate how energy is transferred through rock, water, and air. These models are tested against the geological record. When predicted outcomes match observed deposits, confidence increases. For example, the thickness and distribution of ejecta layers constrain how much material was thrown into the atmosphere and how far it travelled. The presence of tsunami deposits at certain elevations constrains wave height and energy. The deformation of rocks beneath the crater constrains impact angle and speed. Each observation narrows the range of possibilities. One of the striking features of this first day is how impersonal it is. Nothing about the physics targets dinosaurs or any other organisms specifically. The processes are indifferent. Energy moves according to laws that apply everywhere. The destruction is a byproduct, not an aim. This matters for understanding extinction. The first day was devastating locally and regionally, but it did not by itself explain why ecosystems collapsed globally. Many areas would have experienced little direct damage from shockwaves or tsunamis. Some regions were far enough away that the immediate effects were muted. What the first day did accomplish was to inject enormous amounts of material into the atmosphere and oceans, and to alter their physical state abruptly. It transformed the boundary conditions under which life operated. The heat pulse passed, the shaking stopped, the waves eventually dissipated. In some places, life may have resumed activity within days or weeks, but the atmosphere above had changed, and that change would persist. The first day was not the end of the dinosaur world. It was the beginning of a new set of constraints. Understanding this distinction helps keep the story grounded. Extinction is not usually caused by a single blow, no matter how dramatic. It unfolds when environments are altered in ways that organisms cannot quickly adapt to. The physics of the impact set those alterations in motion, by converting motion into heat, pressure, and debris. The collision reshaped the planet's surface and atmosphere in a way that no internal Earth process could replicate on such a timescale. What followed depended not on the impact itself, but on how Earth systems responded to what had just happened. The rocks record the violence of that day. Melt layers, fractured crust, and chaotic deposits preserve the mechanical story. But they also mark a transition. After the shock passed, the planet did not return to its previous state. The first day was brief. Its consequences were not. After the shockwaves faded and the air grew still, the most important change was not what could be seen on the ground, but what happened above it. The atmosphere had been transformed. The impact did not simply excavate a crater and scatter debris locally. It injected vast quantities of material high into the air. Fine dust from pulverized rock, sulfur-rich compounds released from vaporized minerals, and soot from widespread burning all entered the atmosphere within a very short time. Much of this material rose far above weather systems, into layers of air where rain could not easily wash it out. These particles behaved in different ways, but their combined effect was the same. They interfered with sunlight. Dust particles scatter light, reflecting a portion of it back into space. Sulfate aerosols, formed when sulfur compounds react with water vapor, are especially effective at reflecting sunlight. Soot absorbs light, converting it to heat higher in the atmosphere while preventing it from reaching the surface. Together, these components dimmed the world below. This dimming did not require complete darkness to matter. Even a partial reduction in sunlight can have profound biological effects. Plants are finely tuned to light levels. Their growth depends not just on the presence of daylight, but on its intensity and duration. When light drops below a certain threshold, photosynthesis slows. When it slows enough, growth stops. Scientists describe the period that followed the impact as an impact winter. The term does not imply snow covering the planet or temperatures plunging instantly everywhere. Instead, it refers to a sustained interval of reduced sunlight and cooling caused by atmospheric particles. In effect, the planet moved abruptly from a greenhouse world into something closer to a cold, dim state. This was a sharp reversal of the conditions dinosaurs and their ecosystems were adapted to. For millions of years, warmth and steady sunlight had been reliable. Plants had evolved to take advantage of that reliability. Herbivores had evolved to depend on abundant plant growth. Predators had evolved to track herbivore populations. The entire system assumed that light would arrive each day at roughly familiar levels. The impact winter broke that assumption. How long this period lasted depended on the particles involved. Larger dust grains settled out of the atmosphere relatively quickly, falling back to the surface within weeks to months. Finer particles remained suspended longer. Sulfate aerosols can persist for years, reflecting sunlight over extended periods. Soot particles, depending on their size and how high they reached, could also linger, especially if they entered the stratosphere. The chemistry of these particles mattered as much as their size. Sulfates interact with sunlight differently than dust. Soot behaves differently again. The mixture produced by the impact was complex, and its effects were not uniform across the globe. Some regions would have experienced deeper dimming than others. Some may have seen more cooling, others less. But everywhere light levels dropped. This reduction did not have to be extreme to be lethal. Plants do not store long-term energy reserves in a way that allows them to wait out months of darkness. Leaves capture light day by day. When that input declines, sugar production declines with it. Growth slows first. Reproduction falters next. Eventually, tissues begin to die. Even plants that survived the initial dimming would have produced fewer leaves, fewer seeds, and less food. Primary productivity declined across ecosystems. This is the point where extinction begins to take shape, not with explosions or firestorms, but with slowed growth and emptying energy flows. Herbivores were the first animals to feel this change. Large plant eaters require enormous quantities of food to maintain their bodies. When vegetation becomes scarce or nutritionally poor, they cannot simply switch to other resources. Weight loss, weakened immune systems, and reduced reproduction follow. Juveniles suffer most. Populations begin to shrink. Predators followed this decline with a delay. At first, prey became easier to catch as herbivores weakened. But as prey numbers fell, predators faced shortages of their own. Scavenging could offset losses temporarily, but only while carcasses remained available. Once that pulse passed, the decline accelerated. All of this unfolded over weeks to months, not years. The immediate violence of the impact was over quickly. The biological consequences of sunlight loss took longer, but they were relentless. Climate responded alongside biology. With less sunlight reaching the surface, temperatures dropped. Cooling was most pronounced on land, where heat storage is limited. Nights grew colder. Frost may have occurred in regions unaccustomed to it. Seasonal patterns shifted abruptly. Plants already struggling with low light now faced additional stress from temperature extremes. The oceans were affected as well. Surface waters cooled, photosynthetic plankton declined as light penetration decreased. Because marine food webs also depend on photosynthesis, this decline echoed through the seas, affecting everything from microscopic organisms to large predators. Modern understanding of atmospheric behavior helps scientists reconstruct these effects. Researchers who study present-day climate and weather, including those working with organizations such as NOAA, understand how aerosols influence temperature, light, and circulation. While the impact winter itself is inferred from geological evidence, the physical principles governing particle behavior are the same ones observed today. Computer models combine these principles with data from the rock record to estimate how much material entered the atmosphere, how long it stayed there, and how it affected climate. These models are not perfect, but they consistently point toward a prolonged period of reduced sunlight following the impact. What makes this phase so important is that it explains the selectivity of extinction. Not all life vanished. Species with low energy demands, flexible diets, or the ability to shelter survived more readily. Species dependent on constant high levels of productivity did not. Dinosaurs, especially the larger species, were tightly coupled to abundant plant growth. Their success had been built on a world where leaves were plentiful and energy flowed generously. When that flow slowed, their size became a disadvantage rather than an asset. The sunlight problem did not announce itself with noise or flame. It arrived quietly, as dimmer days and colder nights. But it undermined the foundation of every terrestrial ecosystem at once. Understanding this shift is essential. The extinction was not caused primarily by what fell from the sky, but by what failed to reach the ground afterward. The world had changed from above. The sun still shone, but much of its light no longer arrived where it was needed. And in a living system built on photosynthesis, that absence mattered more than anything else. The first day shattered the planet's surface. The weeks that followed starved it of energy. From that point onward, survival depended on how long organisms could endure a world running on less light than it had ever known. When sunlight declined, the most immediate effect was felt by plants, but the most lasting consequences moved upward, step by step, through living systems. This is how extinction usually unfolds, not as a single instant, but as a cascade. Primary productivity is the rate at which plants convert sunlight into new biological material. It is the engine that keeps ecosystems running. When light levels fall, this engine slows. Leaves grow more slowly. New shoots are fewer. Seeds are produced less often. Over time, the total amount of usable plant matter in the environment declines. At first, this change can be subtle. Landscapes may still look green. Some plants persist using stored resources. Others survive by reducing growth rather than dying outright. But the overall flow of energy into the system has been reduced, and everything built on that flow must adjust. Herbivores are next in line. Large plant-eating dinosaurs depended on enormous quantities of vegetation to sustain their bodies. Size brings advantages in stable environments, but it also brings constant demand. A large body must be fueled every day. There is little margin for interruption. When plant growth slows, herbivores cannot simply wait. They must keep eating, even as food becomes scarcer and less nutritious. As vegetation declines, herbivores begin to lose weight. Their immune systems weaken. Injuries heal more slowly. Most importantly, reproduction suffers. Producing eggs requires surplus energy. When that surplus disappears, breeding slows or stops altogether. Juveniles that do hatch face even harsher conditions. with less food available during the most vulnerable stages of life. This is not an immediate collapse. Populations can persist for a time, especially if adult individuals survive on stored reserves. But without successful reproduction, populations are already on a downward path. Extinction begins not when the last individual dies, but when the last generation fails to replace itself. This process creates what ecologists call a trophic cascade. A trophic cascade occurs when changes at one level of a food web propagate upward or downward to other levels. In this case, reduced primary productivity affects herbivores first. As herbivore populations decline, predators are affected next. Predators may initially experience a brief period of abundance, as weakened prey are easier to catch. But this is temporary. Once prey numbers fall below a certain threshold, predators face shortages of their own. Carnivorous dinosaurs were not immune to these dynamics. They relied on a steady supply of prey, often of particular sizes or types. As herbivore diversity declined, predator niches narrowed. Some predators may have switched prey or scavenged more frequently, but flexibility has limits. A hunter adapted to large, slow-moving animals cannot easily survive on small, fast prey alone. Specialization becomes a liability under these conditions. Specialized feeders are animals that rely on a narrow range of food sources. In stable ecosystems, specialization is efficient. It allows animals to extract energy very effectively from a particular resource. But when that resource declines, specialists struggle. Generalists fare better. A generalist is an organism that can eat a wide variety of foods and tolerate a broader range of conditions. Many small mammals, reptiles, and birds fall into this category. They can switch diets, exploit temporary resources, and survive on lower energy intake. Large dinosaurs, particularly those adapted to specific plant types or feeding heights, were far less flexible. This difference helps explain why extinction was selective. It was not random. Animals with high energy demands, slow reproduction, and specialized diets were more likely to disappear. Animals that could shelter, scavenge, or survive on varied food sources had better odds. Not all ecosystems collapsed at the same rate. Freshwater environments such as rivers, lakes, and wetlands may have provided temporary refuges. These systems often rely on detritus, dead organic material, rather than direct photosynthesis alone. Leaves falling into water, decaying plant matter, and organic debris can support food webs even when new plant growth is limited. Algae and bacteria can persist under lower light conditions than many land plants. As a result, some freshwater food webs may have continued functioning longer than their terrestrial counterparts. This does not mean they were unaffected. Reduced sunlight still limited productivity. But the delay may have been enough for certain organisms to survive the worst period. Detritus-based systems act as buffers. They recycle what already exists rather than depending entirely on new input. In times of crisis, this recycling can sustain life temporarily. Eventually, however, without new organic material entering the system, even these webs decline. Marine ecosystems followed similar patterns. Plankton, which form the base of oceanic food webs, depend on light penetrating the surface waters. As light levels dropped, plankton productivity declined. This affected everything from small invertebrates to large marine predators. Again, the process unfolded over time rather than in an instant. Across all environments, the same pattern repeated. Reduced energy input led to reduced growth. Reduced growth led to population decline. Decline led to extinction. This framing matters because it removes drama without removing significance. Extinction does not require constant catastrophe. It can proceed quietly, driven by shortages and failed reproduction rather than sudden death. For dinosaurs, the scale of the problem was magnified by their success. Large bodies, abundant populations, and complex food webs all depended on high, continuous productivity. When that productivity faltered, the system had little slack. It is also important to note what extinction is not. It is not the immediate disappearance of every individual. Fossils show that some dinosaur lineages persisted for a time after the boundary. Others vanished quickly. The record is uneven, reflecting regional differences and varying resilience. But the direction was the same everywhere. Once energy flow was reduced globally, recovery without restoration of sunlight was impossible. Populations could decline slowly or quickly, but they could not reverse course. Reproductive failure plays a central role here. Even if adults survive harsh conditions for months or years, without successful reproduction, extinction is inevitable. Eggs fail to develop. Juveniles fail to thrive. The age structure of populations skews older until there are no replacements left. This is why extinction is often invisible while it's happening. A population may look present until suddenly it is gone. The critical threshold may have been crossed generations earlier. The calmness of this process is deceptive. There is no single moment to point to and say, "This is when it happened." Instead, there is a gradual thinning of life, a narrowing of possibilities, a shrinking of diversity. In the dinosaur world, food chains fell quietly. Forests thinned, herds became smaller, predators ranged farther for fewer returns. Ecosystems that had once supported vast numbers of large animals became unable to do so. The collapse did not roar, it whispered. Understanding extinction this way brings clarity. It shows that the end of the dinosaurs was not caused solely by heat, shock, or fire. Those were triggers. The deeper cause was the loss of energy flow through ecosystems. When the base of the food web fails, everything above it is living on borrowed time. This perspective also explains why survival was uneven. Small, flexible organisms could ride out the lean period. Large, specialized ones could not. The outcome was not a judgment on strength or intelligence. It was a consequence of biology interacting with changed conditions. The dinosaur food web had been efficient, interconnected, and stable for millions of years. That efficiency became its vulnerability when the world supplying it with energy changed. By the time sunlight began to return, many of the largest players were already gone. The collapse had done its work through hunger, failed reproduction, and time. Extinction in this sense is not an explosion, it is an unwinding, and once unwound far enough, it cannot simply be rewound. Extinction did not erase life entirely. That fact alone demands explanation. If the end of the Cretaceous disrupted sunlight, collapsed food webs, and pushed ecosystems past their limits, why did anything survive at all? The answer lies not in strength or intelligence, but in fit. Survival favored organisms whose bodies, behaviors, and life histories happened to match the new conditions. One of the most consistent traits linked to survival was small body size. Smaller animals require less energy to stay alive. They need less food each day, lose heat more slowly when sheltered, and can persist on limited resources for longer periods. When productivity collapsed, this difference mattered immediately. Large dinosaurs were locked into a daily energy economy that assumed abundance. Small animals operated on narrower margins, but those margins were easier to meet when food became scarce. A handful of seeds, insects, or detritus could sustain a small body in ways that were impossible for a massive one. Shelter was another crucial factor. Animals capable of retreating into burrows, crevices, dense vegetation, or water were shielded from the most extreme effects of the first day and the weeks that followed. Burrowing reduces exposure to heat pulses, pressure waves, and falling debris. Later, it buffers temperature swings and limits water loss in a cooling, drying world. Water offered similar protection. Aquatic and semi-aquatic environments change temperature more slowly than land. They can also retain organic material even when new productivity declines. Animals able to move between land and water had access to refuge and alternative food sources that fully terrestrial animals lacked. Dietary flexibility mattered just as much. Generalists, animals able to eat a wide range of foods, were far more likely to persist than specialists. When familiar resources vanished or became unreliable, generalists could switch. They could scavenge, consume detritus, feed on insects, or exploit whatever remained available. This flexibility extended beyond food. Generalists often tolerate broader ranges of temperature, humidity, and habitat. They do not depend on a single ecological niche being maintained. In a world where conditions changed rapidly and unevenly, that tolerance was invaluable. Reproductive strategy also played a role. Species with faster reproduction rates could rebound from population losses more quickly. Even if numbers dropped sharply, producing offspring sooner increased the chance that some would survive through the worst period. Long-lived species with slow reproduction, especially those investing heavily in a small number of offspring, faced greater risk. If reproduction paused for too long, extinction followed, even if adults survived initially. Mammals illustrate how these traits came together. At the end of the Cretaceous, mammals were generally small, inconspicuous animals. They did not dominate ecosystems. Most were nocturnal, active at night when temperatures were cooler and predators fewer. Nocturnality reduced exposure during the immediate aftermath of the impact, and later helped during the dim conditions of impact winter. Many mammals lived in burrows or nests, providing shelter from heat, cold, and debris. Their diets were flexible, ranging from insects and seeds to small vertebrates and plant matter. This adaptability allowed them to exploit whatever resources persisted. Importantly, mammals were not waiting for dinosaurs to disappear. They were simply surviving in the background. When larger animals vanished, mammals did not suddenly become superior. They inherited space, resources, and opportunity because they were still there. Reptiles such as crocodilians and turtles offer another perspective on survival. Crocodilians have low metabolic demands relative to their size. They can go long periods without food, relying on slow metabolism and stored energy. Their semi-aquatic lifestyle provided access to water-based refuges and detritus-driven food webs that persisted longer than terrestrial ones. Turtles share many of these advantages. Their ability to slow their metabolism, combined with protective shells and aquatic habits, allowed them to endure harsh conditions. Neither group depended on constant high productivity. They could wait. Birds, the surviving dinosaurs, also reflect key survival traits. Early birds were generally small, lightweight, and capable of flight, which allowed movement to refuges and scattered resources. Many had flexible diets and rapid reproduction. Feathers provided insulation during cooling, and some species could shelter effectively. Survival, however, came at a cost. Many surviving lineages pass through population bottlenecks. A population bottleneck occurs when numbers drop so low that genetic diversity is sharply reduced. This can happen even if a species avoids extinction. The survivors represent only a fraction of the original variation. Bottlenecks make populations vulnerable to disease and environmental change in the short term. But they do not doom a lineage. Over time, if conditions improve, populations can expand again, and new diversity can arise through mutation and selection. This is exactly what happened after the end of the Cretaceous. The world that followed was quieter, emptier, and less productive at first, but was also open. Lineages that survived the bottleneck found themselves in environments with reduced competition and many unfilled niches. It's important to resist the temptation to frame survival as merit. Survival is not a reward for being stronger, smarter, or better. It is a consequence of compatibility. Traits that are advantageous in one context may be disastrous in another. Dinosaurs were extraordinarily successful for millions of years because they fit their world. When that world changed rapidly, many of their defining traits became liabilities. Likewise, the traits that allowed some animals to survive were not evolved in anticipation of catastrophe. Burrowing, nocturnality, flexible diets, and low energy demands evolved for everyday reasons. They happen to become useful under extreme conditions. Chance plays a role here that is uncomfortable but real. Which lineages survive a mass extinction depends partly on where they are, what they eat, and how their bodies work at the moment conditions change. Small differences can decide outcomes. Two similar species can have very different fates if one happens to live near a refuge or exploit a marginal resource. This perspective removes judgment from extinction. It is not a contest with winners and losers in a moral sense. It is a filter applied by changed conditions. Some organisms pass through, others do not. Understanding survival also reframes the idea of dominance. The animals that persisted after the extinction were not immediately dominant. Mammals did not instantly become large or abundant. Birds did not immediately fill every niche left behind. Recovery took time, often millions of years. Resilience does not mean immunity. Many surviving lineages were reduced to a fraction of their former diversity. Ecosystems remained simplified for long periods. The return of complexity was gradual, but survival mattered. It preserved continuity. Life did not restart from nothing. It adapted using what remained. This continuity is easy to overlook when focusing on what was lost. Dinosaurs vanished from most ecological roles, but the tree of life did not reset. It bent. Some branches broke. Others persisted, thinner but still connected. The story of survival after the end of the dinosaurs is not triumphant. It is quiet and practical. It is about organisms that happen to need less, hide better, eat broadly, and reproduce quickly enough. These traits do not make them superior. They made them compatible with a world that had suddenly changed its rules. In that sense, survival is not about greatness. It is about alignment. When conditions shift abruptly, life does not ask who ruled before. It asks who can endure now. Those that could endured. When the end of the Cretaceous is described as the end of the dinosaurs, something important is usually left unsaid. Dinosaurs did not disappear entirely. One lineage crossed the boundary and continued on, altered but unbroken. Today they are everywhere. Birds are not distant cousins of dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. More precisely, birds belong to a group known as theropods, a lineage of mostly meat-eating dinosaurs that walked on two legs, and included animals as different as small agile hunters and some of the largest predators to ever live. Within this group, one branch gradually acquired traits that would later make survival possible in a changed world. This connection is not metaphorical. It is anatomical and genetic. Birds share key features with theropod dinosaurs, including hollow bones, three-fingered hands modified into wings, similar hip structures, and distinctive ankle joints. These similarities were once debated. Today, they are well supported by fossils and comparative anatomy. Understanding birds as dinosaurs changes how extinction is framed. The story is no longer one of total erasure. It becomes a story of continuity through transformation. Feathers sit at the center of that transformation. Feathers did not evolve for flight at first. The earliest feather-like structures likely served other purposes. Insulation is one. Small animals lose heat quickly, and feathers help trap air close to the body, maintaining temperature. Display is another. Feathers can be colorful, patterned, or elongated, making them useful for communication, mate choice, or intimidation. Over time, feathers diversified. Some became more complex with branching structures that increased surface area. These changes allowed feathers to interact with air in new ways. Eventually, in some lineages, they were co-opted for gliding and then for powered flight. This sequence matters. Flight did not appear suddenly. It was built on features that already existed for other reasons. Evolution rarely invents from scratch. It repurposes. The fossil record preserves this gradual transition with unusual clarity in a few rare locations. One of the most important is Liaoning Province, where fine-grained sediments captured exceptionally detailed fossils from the early Cretaceous. These fossils include dinosaurs with feathers preserved as impressions and carbon traces, showing a wide range of feather types long before true birds appeared. Soft tissues like feathers are rarely preserved because they decay quickly. Most fossilization captures bones and shells. When feathers are preserved, it usually means the animal was buried rapidly in fine sediment under conditions that limited decay. Sites like those in Liaoning offer a rare window into aspects of biology that are usually invisible. These discoveries reshaped understanding of dinosaurs. Feathers were not exclusive to birds, they were widespread among theropods. Flight was not the defining innovation. It was one outcome of a longer evolutionary experiment with insulation, display, and lightweight bodies. When the extinction arrived, some of these feathered theropods were already small, mobile, and adaptable. These traits mattered. Bird lineages that survived were generally small. Small size reduced energy needs. Feathers provided insulation during cooling periods. Wings allowed movement across fragmented landscapes, making it easier to find food or refuge. Flight also allowed escape from local disturbances, increasing the chance of encountering pockets of survivable conditions. Dietary flexibility helped as well. Early birds did not rely on a single food source. Many could eat seeds, insects, small animals, or scavenged material. This generalist approach increased resilience when familiar resources disappeared. Nesting behavior may have contributed too. Eggs laid in protected sites, combined with faster reproduction compared to large dinosaurs, improved the odds that at least some offspring would survive through difficult years. Shelter played a role once again. Birds could roost in trees, cliffs, or dense vegetation. Some could take advantage of freshwater environments. These refuges buffered temperature extremes and reduced exposure to hazards. None of these traits were evolved in anticipation of catastrophe. They existed because they were useful in ordinary life. When conditions changed abruptly, those ordinary advantages became decisive. The survival of birds also helps explain patterns seen after the extinction. The world that followed had fewer large animals and simpler ecosystems. In that context, flight offered access to scattered resources. Small bodies allowed rapid population growth. Feathers supported thermoregulation in a cooler, more variable climate. Over time, birds diversified dramatically. They spread into niches once occupied by other dinosaurs and into entirely new ones. Their success in the modern world is not a sudden triumph. It is the continuation of a lineage that had already learned how to be flexible. This continuity carries an important lesson about evolution. Evolution does not have endpoints. It does not aim toward perfection or dominance. It responds to conditions. When conditions change, pathways shift. Some branches end. Others bend and continue in altered form. From this perspective, the end of the dinosaurs is not a clean break. It is a rerouting. One branch, heavily invested in size and high-energy lifestyles, came to an end. Another, built around small size, feathers, and mobility, persisted. Birds did not replace dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs that survived by being different enough. This reframing also affects how loss is understood. The extinction removed vast diversity and reshaped life on Earth. That loss is real, but it did not erase the entire lineage. A trace remained, alive and evolving, carrying deep history forward. Every bird today is part of that story. Its skeleton reflects ancient theropod ancestry. Its feathers echo functions older than flight. Its metabolism, behavior, and reproduction are shaped by evolutionary pressures that predate the extinction. When a bird lifts off, it is not defying gravity in a novel way. It is expressing a solution that emerged through deep time, refined through crisis, and carried forward through survival. Seeing birds this way restores continuity to the narrative. The dinosaur world did not vanish completely. It narrowed, adapted, and persisted in a form suited to what came next. Evolution did not end at the boundary. It changed direction. And in doing so, it ensured that dinosaurs never fully left the planet they once dominated. When scientists talk about the end of the dinosaurs today, they are rarely arguing about whether something dramatic happened. They're discussing how to weigh multiple lines of evidence, how to interpret timing, and how different processes interacted in a complex system. This is how mature science usually looks. Not a single answer replacing all others, but a picture becoming sharper as uncertainties narrow. At the boundary between the Cretaceous and the period that followed, the geological record carries several independent signals. There is the global spike in iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but common in extraterrestrial material. There are shocked minerals formed only under extreme pressure. There is the Chicxulub crater, matching the boundary in age and scale, and there are biological signals, abrupt changes in fossil assemblages, and clear evidence of ecosystem collapse. Each of these lines of evidence points in the same general direction. Something sudden and global disrupted Earth's systems at that moment in time. On that point, there is strong agreement. Where discussion continues is in how that event interacted with other ongoing processes. Volcanism in the late Cretaceous, particularly the massive outpourings known as the Deccan Traps, released large amounts of gas into the atmosphere over extended periods. Carbon dioxide influences long-term warming. Sulfur compounds can cause short-term cooling and acid rain. These effects are real, measurable, and recorded in the rock record. The key question is not whether this volcanism mattered, but when its most intense phases occurred relative to the extinction. Timing matters enormously. If major volcanic pulses overlapped with ecological stress at the boundary, they could have weakened ecosystems before the impact or compounded its effects afterward. This is where improved geochronology becomes crucial. Dating rocks to deep time is not about reading a timestamp. It's about measuring radioactive decay with increasing precision. As analytical techniques improve, uncertainties shrink. What once could only be dated to within 1 million years can now, in some cases, be narrowed to tens of thousands of years or less. These refinements do not overturn the basic story. They sharpen it. Recent work suggests that significant phases of Deccan volcanism occurred both before and after the boundary, with some pulses close enough in time to plausibly interact with impact-driven stress. This does not mean volcanism alone caused the extinction. It means the background state of the planet may have been altered in ways that affected resilience. Scientists often describe this distinction using the terms proximate cause and contributing factors. A proximate cause is the immediate trigger that directly produces an outcome. In this case, the impact provides a clear proximate cause for sudden atmospheric dust loading, sunlight loss, and rapid climate disruption. Contributing factors are conditions that shape how severe the outcome becomes. Long-term volcanic emissions, sea level changes, and existing ecological stress can all influence how systems respond to a sudden shock. A system already under strain is more likely to fail when hit. This framing allows multiple processes to be acknowledged without confusion. It avoids false choices. The question is not impact or volcanism. It is how impact and background conditions interacted. This approach also reflects how scientists evaluate evidence. They do not seek a single dramatic explanation if multiple processes are supported by data. They ask which explanations best account for all observations, with the fewest assumptions. In this case, the impact hypothesis explains the global synchrony of extinction signals, the presence of shocked minerals, and the existence of a crater of appropriate age and size. Volcanism explains longer-term climate trends and regional environmental stress. Together they form a coherent picture. Scientific humility is important here, but it does not mean uncertainty about everything. There is strong confidence that a large asteroid impact occurred at the boundary and played a decisive role in the extinction. That conclusion is supported by multiple independent data sets. Where refinement continues is in quantifying details. How long did sunlight remain reduced? How quickly did temperatures recover? How much did volcanic gases amplify or dampen those changes? These are not questions about whether the impact happened. They are questions about mechanism and interaction. This distinction matters because it reflects how science progresses. Early ideas are often simplified to establish a foothold. Later work adds nuance. That nuance does not weaken the original insight. It strengthens it by placing it in context. It is also worth noting that debate in science does not imply deep division. Researchers may disagree about proportions and timing while agreeing on the overall framework. This kind of discussion is productive. It drives better measurements, better models, and clearer explanations. As dating improves, as models become more sophisticated, and as new sites are studied, the picture continues to sharpen. The extinction event becomes less of a mystery and more of a case study in how complex systems respond to combined stress. What emerges is not a fragile world destroyed by a single blow, nor a doomed world already collapsing on its own. It is a resilient world pushed beyond its limits by an extraordinary event acting on an already dynamic planet. This perspective also guards against oversimplification. It reminds us that Earth history is rarely shaped by one factor acting in isolation. Climate, geology, biology, and external events intersect. Outcomes depend on timing, scale, and context. The end of the dinosaurs is no longer framed as a debate between competing camps. It is understood as a layered explanation, where one cause dominates the trigger while others shape the response. That balance between confidence and openness is a strength, not a weakness. Science does not seek final answers that never change. It seeks models that explain the most evidence with the greatest clarity, while remaining open to refinement. In the case of the dinosaur extinction, the core explanation is robust. The remaining work is about understanding how all the pieces fit together. Seen this way, the debate is not about uncertainty, it is about resolution. The picture is no longer blurry, it is coming into focus one measurement at a time. After the boundary passed and the worst conditions began to ease, the world did not surge forward into renewal. It paused. What followed the extinction was not a dramatic rebound or a triumphant return of abundance. It was a long, uneven process of rebuilding that unfolded over millions of years. Ecosystems that had once been dense and intricately connected were reduced to simpler forms. Many landscapes were sparsely populated. Energy flowed more slowly, interactions were fewer. Life continued, but at a reduced tempo. This phase is best understood through the idea of ecological succession, scaled up to an entire planet. Succession describes how life returns to disrupted environments in stages. It begins with organisms that can tolerate poor conditions, low competition, and limited resources. These pioneer species are not specialists. They grow quickly, reproduce easily, and spread wherever space allows. They stabilize environments rather than perfect them. After the extinction, pioneer plants appeared across continents. These were species capable of growing in disturbed soils, tolerating temperature swings, and surviving with limited nutrients. Their roots bound loose sediment. Their leaves and stems, when they died, added organic matter back into the ground. Over time, this slow accumulation rebuilt soils that had been stripped or degraded during the crisis. As soils improved, more demanding plants followed. Shrubs replaced sparse ground cover. Trees returned in stages. Forests, where they reformed, were initially simpler than before, with fewer layers and less diversity. But they provided structure. Shade, shelter, and stable microclimates returned gradually. Animals followed these changes rather than leading them. Insects and small invertebrates were among the earliest to re-establish themselves. Their short life cycles and flexible diets allowed them to exploit new plant growth quickly. They became the foundation for terrestrial food webs, supporting small predators and scavengers. Larger animals returned more slowly. Their success depended on the stability of plant communities and the availability of sustained energy flow. Herbivores expanded only once vegetation could support them year after year. Predators followed once herbivore populations were large and reliable enough. This rebuilding did not happen everywhere at the same rate. Geography mattered. Climate mattered. Chance mattered. Some regions recovered relatively quickly, especially those less affected by cooling or darkness. Others remained ecologically simplified for long periods. Local refugees acted as sources for recolonization, sending out populations that slowly expanded into surrounding areas. Over time, these patches connected and ecosystems regained broader complexity. One of the most important processes shaping this phase was adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation occurs when surviving lineages diversify rapidly in response to newly available ecological space. After the extinction, many niches were empty. Large herbivores were gone. Apex predators were gone. Entire feeding strategies had vanished. For surviving organisms, this represented opportunity rather than competition. Mammals provide a clear example. Before the extinction, mammals were generally small and ecologically constrained. They lived in the margins, often nocturnal, often specialized for particular diets or behaviors. After the extinction, those constraints loosened. With fewer large animals dominating ecosystems, mammals encountered less competition and predation pressure. This did not mean mammals immediately grew large or diverse. At first, they remained small, but over time, differences among populations accumulated. Some lineages experimented with larger body sizes. Others adapted to new diets. Some became herbivores, others predators, others omnivores exploiting whatever resources were available. Over millions of years, this experimentation produced a wide range of forms. Mammals began to occupy ecological roles that had been unavailable to them before. The diversity seen in later periods did not arise from a single burst, but from prolonged diversification driven by opportunity and selection. Importantly, this process was not directed. There was no goal to replace dinosaurs. Mammals diversified because conditions allowed variation to persist and spread. Many experiments failed, some succeeded. The outcome was shaped by environment, not intention. Marine ecosystems followed a different path. In the oceans, recovery depended heavily on microscopic life. Plankton formed the base of marine food webs, and their recovery set the pace for everything above them. After the extinction, many plankton groups were severely reduced. Some disappeared entirely, others survived in low numbers. Because plankton respond directly to light and nutrient availability, their recovery tracked changes in climate and ocean chemistry. As sunlight returned and conditions stabilized, plankton populations slowly increased. This supported the return of small marine animals, which in turn supported larger predators. However, marine recovery was uneven and prolonged. Some ocean regions rebounded faster than others. Changes in temperature, circulation, and acidity influenced which organisms could thrive. Reef ecosystems, for example, remained simplified for millions of years. Complex reef structures did not reappear immediately, even after primary productivity improved. This highlights an important point. Recovery is not uniform across environments. Land and sea operate under different constraints. Terrestrial ecosystems depend on soil development and plant succession. Marine ecosystems depend on chemistry, circulation, and microscopic life. Both can recover, but their timelines differ. Across all environments, the same underlying mechanisms drove rebuilding. Reproduction continued, variation arose, selection favored traits suited to new conditions. Over many generations, these small changes accumulated into new ecosystems. There was no return to the old world. The ecosystems that emerged after the extinction were not replicas of those that had been lost. They were reorganized systems built from surviving lineages under altered conditions. Some ecological roles reappeared in modified forms, others vanished permanently. This distinction matters. Recovery does not mean reversal. The planet did not undo the extinction. It adapted to its aftermath. New balances formed, new interactions stabilized. Life continued, but it continued differently. Resilience in this context is often misunderstood. It does not imply that life easily absorbs catastrophe, or that losses are insignificant. The extinction removed vast amounts of diversity. Entire lineages vanished. Recovery took tens of millions of years. That cost cannot be minimized. Resilience simply means that life can reorganize when fundamental conditions allow it. It does not promise speed, completeness, or fairness. The pace of this rebuilding is central to understanding Earth history. On human timescales, the recovery would appear almost static. Generations would pass with little visible change. On geological timescales, however, the transformation is profound. Entire faunas and floras emerge where none existed before. This slowness is not a flaw. It is a property of complex systems. Complexity arises gradually through repeated interactions and refinements. When complexity collapses, it takes equally long to rebuild. By the time ecosystems regained high diversity, the planet itself had changed. Continents had drifted, climates had shifted. The baseline conditions were no longer those of the late Cretaceous. The recovery was therefore creative rather than restorative. What filled the empty space left by the dinosaurs was not a replacement, but a reconfiguration. New worlds assembled from old components, arranged under new constraints. This brings the story back to patience. The extinction boundary marks a sharp transition in the rock record, but the world on either side of it is separated by millions of years of adjustment. Life does not hurry. It persists where it can, expands where conditions allow, and retreats where they do not. There is no narrative arc driving this process. No triumph, no tragedy, no intention, just continuity shaped by time. The long recovery reminds us that absence is not permanent, but neither is presence. Ecosystems fill available space, but the forms they take depend entirely on what survives and what conditions follow. Empty space does not remain empty forever, but it never fills in the same way twice. Given enough time, complexity returns, not as a restoration of the past, but as the foundation of something new. For geologists, the phrase "the last day" does not describe a sunset, a moment of panic, or a single turning of the planet. It describes a boundary. In the rock record, there is a thin layer that appears again and again across continents and ocean basins. Below it, the world is recognizably Mesozoic. Above it, something fundamental has changed. That line marks the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of a different chapter in Earth's history. It is a line drawn not by a calendar, but by chemistry, fossils, and disrupted patterns of life. This is what the last day means in geology. It is shorthand for a transition that unfolds across multiple timescales at once. Some processes happen in minutes, others take years, still others stretch across generations. The boundary compresses all of that into a single horizon that scientists can recognize wherever they look. That recognizability is important. It tells us that what happened was not local. It was global. The reason this boundary stands out so clearly is not because one clue dominates, but because many independent signals converge. A spike in rare elements appears at the same level worldwide. Minerals show evidence of extreme pressure. Fossil communities change abruptly. Climate indicators shift. Together, these signals tell a consistent story of disruption followed by reorganization. Reconstructing the last day, then, is not about imagining drama. It is about tracing mechanisms. The sequence begins far above the planet, with an object following a stable orbit under the steady influence of gravity. Over deep time, small nudges altered that path until it intersected Earth's. When that intersection occurred, motion was converted into energy in a very short span of time. At the point of impact, kinetic energy became heat, shock, and excavation. Rock melted and vaporized. Shock waves traveled through the ground and the atmosphere. Material was launched upward and outward, some of it far beyond the immediate surroundings. This initial phase unfolded quickly. The crater formed within minutes. Seismic shaking and air blast followed soon after. Tsunamis propagated across shallow seas. These effects were devastating near the impact site and significant across wide regions. But they were not what ultimately ended the dinosaur world. The more consequential changes unfolded above the surface. Dust, sulfate aerosols, and soot entered the atmosphere in enormous quantities. Fine particles spread globally, lingering high above weather systems. These particles interacted with sunlight, reflecting and absorbing it before it could reach the ground. The result was a dimming of the surface, not complete darkness, but a sustained reduction in light. This change was enough to disrupt photosynthesis. Plants slowed their growth. Some stopped growing altogether. Primary productivity declined across land and sea. This shift mattered because photosynthesis is the entry point for energy into nearly all ecosystems. When that entry point narrows, everything above it is affected. The world did not need to burn everywhere or shake everywhere to be transformed. It needed less light. As days turned into weeks, the consequences of reduced sunlight accumulated. Temperatures dropped, especially on land. Seasonal patterns were disrupted. Frost appeared in regions unaccustomed to it. Plants struggled to maintain normal growth and reproduction. Herbivores responded next. Large plant-eating dinosaurs, dependent on constant abundant vegetation, faced shortages. Weight loss, weakened immune systems, and reproductive failure followed. Populations began to decline, not all at once but steadily. Predators followed the same path with a delay. At first, weakened prey were easier to catch, then prey became scarce. Scavenging could sustain some species briefly, but only while carcasses remained. Eventually, the decline reached every level of the food web. This is where extinction takes shape, not as a single moment of death, but as a process of starvation, failed reproduction, and population collapse unfolding over years. At the same time, survival was selective. Small animals with low energy demands fared better than large ones. Generalists survived more readily than specialists. Species able to shelter in burrows, water, or protected microhabitats were buffered from extremes. Those capable of flexible diets and faster reproduction had better odds. Some lineages passed through severe population bottlenecks, reduced to a fraction of their former diversity. Others vanished entirely. The outcome was not a judgment of worth or strength. It was the result of fit between traits and altered conditions. Seen this way, the last day is not a single day at all. It is a boundary that captures a cascade. The impact marks the trigger. The weeks that followed mark the onset of ecological collapse. The years that followed determined which lineages could persist. The millions of years that followed reshaped life entirely. What gives scientists confidence in this reconstruction is not one dramatic clue, but the way different kinds of evidence reinforce one another. Geochemistry records extraterrestrial material arriving at the same moment ecosystems changed. Minerals preserve the pressures only an impact can produce. Gravity and magnetic data reveal a buried crater of the right age and scale. Drill cores record melt, breccia, and recovery in sequence. Climate models show how injected particles alter light and temperature. Fossils show selective loss consistent with energy starvation rather than random destruction. Each line of evidence has limitations on its own. Together they form a coherent picture. This convergence is important because it anchors the story in method rather than imagination. Scientists do not reconstruct the last day by picturing what it might have looked like. They reconstruct it by asking what must have happened to produce the signals preserved in rock, chemistry, and biology. That approach also explains why the boundary is so globally consistent. It reflects processes that affected the entire planet at once. Atmospheric circulation spread particles worldwide. Ocean currents redistributed heat and chemistry. Food webs everywhere depended on the same sunlight. The last day in this sense was shared. At the same time, it was not experienced identically everywhere. Some regions were closer to the impact and experienced more immediate destruction. Others were far away and felt the change primarily through dimming and cooling. Some ecosystems had refuges that delayed collapse. Others did not. This unevenness is visible in the fossil record. Extinction patterns vary by region and group, even though the overall direction is the same. This variation does not weaken the explanation. It strengthens it by matching what complex systems do under global stress. As the years passed and the atmosphere slowly cleared, sunlight returned. Temperatures stabilized. Photosynthesis resumed. But the world that emerged was not the one that had been lost. Many large dinosaurs were already gone. Ecosystems were simplified. Survivors expanded into empty spaces. Over millions of years, new communities formed, shaped by different balances and different constraints. From a geological perspective, this entire sequence is captured in a thin layer of rock. That compression of time is misleading if taken literally, but powerful if understood correctly. It reminds us that deep history can turn on relatively brief disruptions, provided their effect propagate through fundamental systems. The phrase, "the last day of the dinosaurs," is therefore accurate and incomplete at the same time. It is accurate because there is a clear before and after. It is incomplete because the transition cannot be reduced to a single sunrise and sunset. It spans minutes, years, and generations, all folded into a boundary that the Earth preserves quietly. Ending the story here does not mean ending the world. For some lineages, the last day truly was the end. Their traits, finely tuned to a stable, productive world, could not accommodate prolonged darkness and scarcity. They vanished, leaving only fossils and gaps in the tree of life. For others, the boundary was a passage rather than a wall. Birds crossed it, mammals crossed it, turtles, crocodilians, and many small organisms crossed it. Life narrowed, but it did not stop, and the planet itself continued on, orbiting the sun, cycling seasons, reshaping its surface through slow, steady processes. Plate tectonics did not pause. Oceans continued to circulate. Gravity continued to govern motion above and below. The last day of the dinosaurs did not break the rhythm of the Earth. It altered the cast. Seen from far enough away, this is the quiet lesson the boundary offers. Worlds can be stable for millions of years and still change abruptly. Extinction can unfold without drama, driven by physics and biology rather than intent. Recovery can take far longer than collapse, and yet through all of it, the planet keeps time in its own way. Layers accumulate, signals persist, life reorganizes. The last day marks an ending, but not a full stop. It is a comma in a much longer sentence written in stone, chemistry, and deep time. The dinosaurs had their world. It worked until it didn't. After that, the Earth continued, carrying the record forward, patient and precise, waiting for careful observers to learn how to read it. When the story of the dinosaurs is told as a rise and a fall, it can sound like a failure. A long reign ending in catastrophe, cut short by forces beyond control. But that framing misses what the rock record actually shows. The dinosaur era was not a failed experiment. It was one of the most successful chapters in the history of life on Earth. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs shaped ecosystems across every continent. They diversified into thousands of forms, occupied nearly every terrestrial niche, and became woven into food webs that were stable, productive, and resilient over spans of time far longer than human history. Forests grew and regrew beneath their footsteps. Coastlines shifted while they adapted. Continents drifted while their lineages persisted. That length of success matters. It tells us that the dinosaur world worked. Not briefly, not precariously, but reliably, under physical laws that remained consistent across deep time. The ending of that world was not a judgment on its worth. It was a transition driven by a rare convergence of events, one that altered the conditions under which that success had been built. When those conditions changed abruptly, the system reorganized. Some lineages could follow the change, Others could not. This is not a void in Earth history. It is a handoff. Seen through geological time, mass extinctions are not erasures of meaning. They are boundaries between ways of living. They compress long stories into thin layers of rock, marking moments when the planet's rules shifted faster than life could fully adjust. The reason scientists can understand these moments at all is because the underlying physics never stopped behaving predictably. Gravity continued to guide orbits. Energy continued to move according to the same principles. Atoms decayed at steady rates. Light interacted with matter in consistent ways. Because those laws did not change, the signals left behind remained legible. A thin clay layer rich in unusual elements. Crystals bearing microscopic scars of pressure. Fossils that vanish and reappear above and below a line. None of these clues require imagination to interpret. They require patience. Over time, sediment buried the scars of the impact. Oceans smoothed coastlines. Forests returned. The surface forgot what happened, but the rocks did not. They kept the record quietly, layer by layer, waiting. This quiet persistence is one of the most grounding aspects of Earth history. Even events that reshape life globally eventually become just another horizon in stone. What once altered climates and ecosystems across the planet now appears as a band measured in centimeters, easily stepped over in an outcrop. From a distance, the drama dissolves into continuity. After the dinosaurs, the Earth did not rush. It did not attempt to restore what had been lost. It continued doing what it always does. Plates moved, mountains eroded, rivers shifted their courses, life adapted to whatever conditions remained possible. Over millions of years, new ecosystems formed, mammals diversified, birds spread, forests took on different shapes. The world became unfamiliar again, not because it was broken, but because it was different. This slow rebuilding reinforces an important perspective. Stability in nature does not mean permanence. It means persistence under given conditions. When those conditions change beyond certain limits, even the most successful systems reorganize. The dinosaur era did not end because it was weak. It ended because it was tuned to a world that no longer existed. And yet, even that ending was incomplete. Birds carry dinosaur history forward every day. Their bones, feathers, and behaviors trace back through the boundary. Each one is a reminder that extinction is rarely absolute. Lineages narrow, transform, and continue. From the standpoint of deep time, the Earth does not experience loss the way humans do. It experiences change. Layers accumulate, systems reorganize, patterns emerge, dissolve, and reappear in new forms. What feels sudden and catastrophic on human scales becomes gradual and almost gentle when spread across millions of years. The violence of the impact fades into a signal. The collapse of ecosystems becomes a thinning of diversity. Recovery becomes a long curve rather than a rebound. This is not to minimize what was lost. Entire ways of being vanished. Ecological roles disappeared forever. The absence left behind reshaped the future of life. Those losses are real, but they exist within a larger continuity. The same physical laws that made the extinction possible also made it understandable. The same processes that disrupted ecosystems allowed them to rebuild. The same gravity that guided an asteroid into collision keeps the moon in its steady path and the oceans moving in rhythm. Nothing about the event required chaos in the universe. It required alignment. That alignment passed, the conditions changed again, the Earth moved on. In the end, the story of the dinosaurs is not a warning about fragility alone. It is a lesson in scale. Worlds can be stable for immense spans of time and still change abruptly. Collapse can unfold quietly. through missed generations rather than instant destruction. Recovery can take far longer than loss without restoring what came before, and through all of it the planet keeps time. Sediment settles, isotopes decay, fossils form, layers stack up one after another, turning events into records and moments into memory. After the dinosaurs, the Earth continues, not with urgency, not with intent, but with calm persistence, following the same rules it always has, allowing life to respond, reorganize, and endure where it can. The boundary that marks the end of the dinosaur world is now just another layer beneath our feet. Quiet, stable, ordinary. Given enough time, even the most dramatic endings become part of the background, and the Earth keeps going,